Welcome back, folks. If you're watching this, my final video in the Dream Stars series, I hope you've taken the time to watch all the others first because I'm about to spill the beans. Now, I know it's often better to allow people to interpret things on their own, and explaining all the mysteries outright can distract from the enjoyment as well as the replay value that something might have when it comes to enticing a reader or listener, in this case, to come back to a creation and seek a deeper meaning and a better understanding. However, I stuffed this thing so full of iconography and connective symbolism that I would be remiss if I didn't archive some of the expository conclusions for myself, let alone for you out there. So it's something I felt like I needed to do. The uncanny thing about symbolism, it perpetuates itself. Just when you think you've got a clear picture of something in its entirety, you notice something else that slipped right past you and covered this whole other perspective with even more symbolism to unpack. So that being said, you might notice some things that I've overlooked, and that's awesome. Please, by all means, leave a comment about it because I would love to know what you got from this story because my perspective is rather skewed. I can never approach it or enjoy it in the way that others will because it's such a well-known part of me at this point. It's like I've gone tone deaf to it. I've been so deeply enveloped in it for so long that I can't see the proverbial forest for the trees. So I'd love to have a discussion about it with you if you want to comment or even drop me a private message or whatever, and I hope it's interesting enough for you that you do want to talk about it. Now, my plan here is to take this one chapter at a time. This is kind of front-loaded because a lot of the symbolism shows up right away, and then later on, I'll make reference to it. I want to discuss, sort of like the phrasing and the illustrations and my use of personal symbols as well as cultural and universal ones that I was not taking for granted. There was cultural appropriation that takes place here is referenced on purpose. Like I make a point to say that, this is from Hindu mythology, this is from Greek mythology because these things inspired me and they're part of the story because they're part of my brain. And rather than try to hide that, I wanted to honor it. So hopefully that comes through in the writing as well as what I'm about to explain. I want to paint a broader picture of what all of this boils down to, this very essential sort of fairy tale that I created. So, let's get started, shall we? The Dream Stars is the title of the book. The title is also the MacGuffin of the story. And a MacGuffin is a term that's given to a plot device that's exclusive purpose is to drive the story forward. It's revealed that despite the fact that these dream stars being treasures, the protagonist only sort of collects them by circumstance and coincidence. They serve little purpose beyond that, though I did try to integrate them as components that amplified powers or imbued characters and objects with special new abilities so they wouldn't seem completely superfluous. Each dream star is symbolic of the birthstone attributed to the month in which they are acquired. The entire story does represent a calendar year. It's a year-long cycle, and time is an important theme throughout the story. So the dreaming about stars, from what I've read, symbolizes both friendship, and since the story is chock full of symbolic characters that represent friends of mine, that made sense. Dreaming about stars can also suggest that your dream will come true. When you wish upon a star, it grants you potentially good luck and, fame, becoming a star yourself. So these considerations contributed to the title. Plus, dreams are mysterious, stars are brilliant. The words hold an almost branded meaning, and they're very different in that regard in their characterization. So it was kind of the perfect title. And the cover, if you notice, shows a hand. You can assume that that belongs to the protagonist. Poet is wearing the first dream star, the ruby ring, the heirloom of Poet's family, Gleam. Ruby is the birthstone of the month of July, and hence that is when our story begins. In fact, the first day of the Dream Stars calendar is July 12th, which is a special day in my life as it is my mother's birthday. People born under the Western zodiac sun sign of Cancer, as my mother is, are often referred to as moon children. Because the moon is their ruling planet, that makes sense. My mom's a moon child, so I referred to her as a moonbeam, and hence the moon as a symbol shows up quite often as a background symbol throughout the story, eclipsing, controlling tides, and even fragmenting and then coming back together again. We see the silhouettes on the cover of Poet and Lukiat with their respective bows drawn, standing to either side of a stylized depiction of the laughing tree, obviously much thinner and sort of more eerie looking, the silhouette. I wanted the cover to feel different from the interior illustrations, more arcane and mysterious, as though sort of opening the book opens a portal into a different realm. And we see the nom de plume I used to make the experience of holding and reading the book that much more like, reaching into the story itself and becoming a part of it. P.S. Sylvan, the author of the book, that's me. A version of me. a part of me. And the spine has a green key hovering above a keyhole to the stars, which are both symbols repeated throughout the story. Aside from their specific purposes within the story, the green key is symbolic of progress and growth by unlocking doors to the infinite possibilities. And the keyhole is a way of peeking into infinity, the standard symbolic shape being a circle overlapped by a triangle. Circles and triangles are the two most prominent symbolic shapes throughout this story. Circles are continuous cycles, and the sun and the moon, the face of the clock, those all kind of fall into that category, while triangles are trinities, past, present, and future, hours, minutes, and seconds, the maiden, mother, and crone, or in psychology, the id, the ego, and the superego, that's Freudian, which were inspirations when developing the protagonist's component parts. On the reverse side, we see a bunch of the symbols that are peppered throughout the story. The dream stars themselves, the monthly flowers that denote each chapter, the dream zodiac icons, the triune symbol that represents poet in her three distinct forms, both she, or poet, Lukiat, and Sophia. The ego, the id, and the superego, respectively. The spiral symbol, which it denotes the passage of time, but without the perpetuity of a circle, it actually symbolizes entropy. The notion that things do eventually end rather than just going on in the same manner forever. Something must change in order to start the cycle again. It also symbolizes the idea that even the most predictable systems have elements of unpredictability, and that there is order in chaos. You'll see that spiral throughout in the background and in different areas in the story. We also get my personal icon used for my art and illustration brand. On the back there, that's the heart with the crown. I love the shape of a heart. The heart's my favorite shape. And you also get Zeke, the mouse. He's there, of course, taking full advantage of his special dream power to move in and out of the pages of the story at will. He represents more that we'll cover as we get into the first chapter. Needless to say, at this point, he's something of an usher, leading us into the story, as we will see. The reverse interior of the dust jacket, as well as the actual hard cover, display circles of symbols. We already saw a version of the hard cover on the reverse of the dust jacket, the dream zodiac, each symbol representing a character, a month, and thereby a chapter. Then the red circle is more like a clock, in that the symbols represent hours instead of months. So starting at the 12 spot, we've got the hour of the Redbird, the grouper, the coyote, the ascendant, the bull, the facets of Uhai, Gidak unchained with the dream star distillate, the cricket, the aggregates of Zorn, the finch, Tumble's jester cap, and the albatross. And while the monthly symbols are starting at the 12th month, the sloth, then the starfish, the dragonfly, the snail, a scarlet-breasted roller, the seahorse, Penumbra the fox, Hellbender the geckomelion, the sunbear, the kestrel, the cobra, and the mouse. Each circle is supported by a triangle going in opposite directions. As two triangles stacked up with one point connecting, this creates the symbol of like an hourglass. And the hardcover displays the green scissors, a symbol of going against nature in order to grow in a perhaps unintended direction. The tang of the scissors, which is the name given to this little hook on the rim of one of the finger holes, indicates that these are barber shears. You've probably seen them before. Gone to get your hair cut, you see they have that little thing that kind of curves off like that. However, this tang that I've drawn is purposely curved in the wrong direction to denote that they are not ideal or of this world, like a reflection. Also, there was a specific make of scissors in the 1800s used for embroidery that were shaped like a stork, or the bill of a stork, because as the old wives' tale goes, the stork delivers the baby, so these scissors were used as umbilical clamps during birth to separate the child from the mother. The pair of scissors is behind the triune nature symbol, a blossom, and there's a fruit and a seed. The shape mimics that of a pair of closed scissors, as well as a triangle shape, more shapes of circles and triangles and spirals. They're just repeating over and over again here. Red and green are complementary colors. They contrast and thereby enhance one another. Red symbolizes lifeblood and passion, and green is growth. And again, we see both circles and triangles overlapping. We often measure time in 3s and 4s, as I mentioned, seconds, minutes, and hours, morning, noon, and night. On a calendar, we have months, weeks, and days. And the spine of the hardcover displays the crossed red and green keys, Cross keys are often attributed to Christianity, in this case denoting the passage between realms, and the power to move between the dimensions of time in either direction, negating time's power over us. The five-pointed star has been found throughout history in many cultures, but my favorite meanings see the star sort of like a person, four limbs in the head pointing towards heaven. Also, four cardinal compass points, each one attributed to an element, the fifth one pointing towards the ether. Fire, earth, air, and water are the four elements. There's also four seasons: summer, autumn, winter, and spring. There is a trident at the bottom, symbolizing the id and the ego and the superego, because the Greek letter psi, PSI, which has been accepted as the symbol for the study of psychology, somewhat resembles a trident. I didn't want to make it too on the nose, so I didn't design it to appear exactly like that Greek letter. I probably could have made the edges curl out a little bit more, made the middle one straight up and down, but it still symbolizes the same thing to me, at least, and now you know that's what I meant by it. We also see an open eye, symbol of awareness and of being awake, end of the sleep cycle, symbolized within the pupil by another spiral. Hourglass shape behind that again, denoting time, a symbol for infinity, a lazy 8, which is just sort of a twisted circle showing the self-perpetuation of eternity, the same way an hourglass can be turned over, though there's still a definitive ending to one side, but it only means the other side is ready to begin. And then finally, there's that monogram of our protagonist, which was also on both sides of the dust jacket, the PS overlapping. PS traditionally means postscript in a letter, like, oh, I have another thought, an additional thought to a written letter, an afterthought, but one important enough to be included as an addendum. So in a way, as important as her name is being her end goal, it's also an afterthought in the sense that it really doesn't come into play till the story is over, despite it having been revealed in the books forward. I guess I was hoping you'd forget about it and sort of fool yourself once the enigmatic nature of the story took hold and distracted you from it. And by the way, it's a little bit of a stretch, but the PS, if you look at it, can also be read as a JD, which are my initials, so I thought that was cool. The interior of each cover, on each side, the front and back, it displays this sort of multi-layer sigil, and each of the four major overlapping shapes are symbols for the seasons that Poet wears on her chest throughout the story. A triangle, a diamond, a hexagon, and a square. And these are actually meant to be 2D representations of the elements as the three-dimensional platonic solids. Fire is a tetrahedron, spirit. Earth is a hexahedron, or a cube, which is the body. Air is an octahedron, which is the mind. And water is an icosahedron, the heart. And the ether would be symbolized by a dodecahedron, which is another name for that chamber within the gazing chamber, where she can pretty much enter any dimension that she wants to. So if you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons, you're probably familiar with polyhedral dice. All of those dice are representative of those platonic solids. In the center of the sigil, we've got the spiral, and then the triune nature glyphs, as well as her monogram, and some of the Zorn font, that arcane fire tongue, which is meant to invoke the feeling of like ancient Sanskrit or hieroglyphic languages. The two mirror images are reversed from each other to remind us of the reflective nature of the story, a callback to the whole mirror thing. Seeing one's reflection reveals more about oneself, maybe the darker aspects, but I did create that font as well as two other fonts for this story. Now the front and back matter display that red feather quill and the bottle of ink with the letter N on its label denoting Nyxerva, its version of ambrosia, which keeps the gods and imaginary beings alike immortal through the writing of stories. The letter N can likewise be turned on its side to become a Z, associated with snoring. It was comic strips, actually, that popularized the letter Z as a stand-in sound effect for snoring. So catching some Z's refers to snoring or sleeping. And the red feather is usually seen as a good omen, like an omen of luck, vitality, and healing. In this case, it's a single drop of blood from the dreamer, donated to the cause. It also indicates wisdom, power, and freedom. And as a writing implement, it allows all of these virtues to sort of flow from its tip when engaged in writing. The publication and title pages that follow repeat these symbols: the red feather, the inkwell, which is spilled, a viscous purple liquid, and the color purple is used frequently in this story to warn of potential danger. Not necessarily evil, but just potential danger. So keep an eye out for purple objects and characters. I made up my own press symbol, Guild O' the Lily, so the play on the idea of a publication guild and the term gilding, in this case, two different spellings of the same word, to add more and to try to sort of beautify and improve upon something that is already by nature very beautiful. I have a tendency to overwork things. That's meant as a cheeky joke. It's me trying in vain to improve upon or overworking something that's meant to be quite simple. Also, there's the little amphibian symbol, which looks like both a froggy footprint and sort of like the strange finger-shaped phantoms throughout Chapter 9, and they show up again in Chapter 12. They're referencing the notion that I am creative as both an artist and a writer, being of two disciplines and thereby two distinct worlds and approaches, and the practicality of explanation is the idea of being amphibious is always a cool thought. So, P.S. Sylvan is the author of this storybook. And then Simon Sandpiper. This says that I'm in control in terms of execution, and the bird is playful and in touch with emotions as it's always dripping its feet in tempestuous waters. That's what sandpipers do. So, I'm Simon says, and Simon the Sandpiper. I'm in control, but I'm having a good time. Problem solving, adaptability, perseverance, these are ideas that are sort of associated with the sandpiper. And birds, generally speaking, symbolize both freedom and the ability to carry messages beyond the veil. Of course, the use of alliteration, again, goes along with our protagonist's initials, PSS. And those are all just sort of part of the same aesthetic. And we see the mouse here again, having spilled the Nyxerva, tracking inky footprints over to the blank white of the page, and finger painting that spiral symbol as though sort of creating a portal into the book and into the story itself for him to enter. And as we turn to the dedication pages, we'll see representations of those triune nature symbols again, the blossom, the seed, and the fruit. The fruit is bleeding juice, which is the same color as the Nyxerva, and it's creating a heart-shaped puddle to show that without the love and support of my parents, this project would not have borne fruit. And that's why I dedicated it to them. It kind of makes sense, too, with the narrative. The following foreword, which is written by Simon Sandpiper, a.k.a. the Reverend Isaac Sylvan, aggregate of the ecliptic and founder member of the eternal continuum of peace, love, and truth, is my persona, who also goes by the nickname Equinox. That's also a reference to one of the halves of Spiritooth, but it's a direct reference to Tarot D, the didactic tarot, as he, Isaac Sylvan, is the host and narrator of that compendium of symbols. He's a mainstay character for me, and he's part of another story too that maybe somewhere down the line we'll do that. He's the host, narrator, and he's a wizardly character who reads the tarot, and that's why the first video that I did for the Dream Stars showed him, the Reverend, in the midst of a reading before he sort of grabs the book and puts that on top of it to show, oh, it's time for this now instead. We did that long enough, now it's time for this. He talks about Poet in the foreword and references her and her creativity. We see all of the previous symbols repeated throughout the foreword and the progression of this pair of ghostly eyes that are sort of gradually opening until we reach the table of contents where the eyes are fully open again. We see that spiral symbol again inside the pupil of the awakening eyes, which upon viewing the table of contents you can see the complete picture and how the cycle will perpetuate itself. 3 chapters are clustered into the first 4 seasonal shards. The summer shard, here we see some symbols and iconographic images meant to appear as lancet and rose windows from a cathedral. Each of the shards starts this way. This foreshadows the sort of final chapter style, this somewhat religious connotation that these windows, these works of art take on as a part of an allegory and a narrative. The rose window displays the monthly flowers and gems, or the dream stars, and the lancet windows are sort of these little summary images hinting at the characters and events of that particular chapter. We continue following the mouse's inky footprints into the story, and each shard begins with an introductory preface read in a slithering voice, and written in the same font as the foreword, revealing that this voice is connected to the author of the foreword. So we're starting to see a few more symbolic icons here as well, but I'll address those particular glyphs a bit later on in context to the story. And yes, at this point I feel like I need to apologize for the inconsistency. It took me like the better part of 3 months to read this book. The voices, I had formulas for them, but I did my best to make them somewhat consistent. They certainly aren't. There are times when you can't tell which one's which, but I think like there's enough separateness between the pages and between the chapters that you can kind of let that go. And the quality of the videos are definitely get better by the end because I was saving them at a lower resolution. Even the sound quality is not as good in the earlier videos, but it's still there. You can still hear it. You can still tell what's going on. And of course, if you want to read along or you want clarification of anything, you can always go to the Facebook page where every single page of this book is there for you to look at for free. So you could read the whole book right there online on Facebook. Let's get into the first chapter. Chapter 1, Larkspur. So we start off with Larkspur, and that's the birth flower for the month of July. The first color of the rainbow is red, the lowest wavelength. The borders display thorny branches, sharp and angular. In the four corners of each illustrative page, we'll see the seasonal symbol in the upper left, in this case, summer, meant to look like a sun with radiant tears, triangles repeated beneath an octagon, foreshadowing the following season. The upper right displays the monthly dream zodiac symbol, in this case the starfish. The lower left displays one of the three phases of Poet's journey, the blossom, which is the maiden, which coincidentally is in the title, Awaken the Maiden, because that's exactly what we are doing here by starting our read. And then finally in the lower right symbol is the most enigmatic. It is the shadow or id equivalent to the upper left symbol, as Lukiot wears symbols like Poet, but they're distortions of those themes. This is Lukiot's summer symbol. Both the light and the shadow are governed by the passage of time and the changing of seasons, hence this connection. So each chapter begins with a large letter to give the feel of those older books, the grand calligraphic chapter heading letters, but they also serve as a secondary purpose that each letter is part of a phrase spelling out, I am the dreamer, and to show that sort of, self-awareness of the story and its author. Also, each chapter letter is hugged by the symbolic creature whose monthly symbol decorates the upper right corner of each illustrative page for that chapter. The mouse's footprints continue to lead us into this chapter, as he has not yet leapt into the fray and is still an observer, as we are. With the very first sentence, our narrator is established and reveals the most telling part of the whole story. She says, I am a figment of your imagination, speaking directly to me, the writer, but also to the reader who chooses to dive into this story. She's told you the truth out the door. But my hopes are at this point the reader isn't prepared to digest that notion yet and just sort of passes it off as poetic subterfuge. So she is writing while narrating and also speaking telepathically, sort of to her unborn child, who is this ghostly idea we see rising out of the green book she's writing in with a red feather quill. This symbolizes that the story is the child and vice versa. The first illustration is framed by an opening eyelid, also suggesting that when we close our eyes on one side of the dream, we open them on the other side. And the tear duct has a silver fish in its pooling lacrimae, and the mouse is sort of peering into the story from the border, preparing to enter the narrative. She is wearing mostly red, with blue jean shorts showing her connection to the driver's reality. And the driver, being her sweetheart, he wears all blue. His car is likewise blue. This is sort of the start of my use of color symbolically. Blue is peaceful, familiar, somewhat melancholy. The interior of the car's roof has all manner of symbols churning about like serpents chewing on hearts to show the inside of my cranium. My brain decor is doubtless lots of hearts and dragons, because hearts are my favorite shape, and dragons, well, who doesn't like a good dragon? There's also a crab, which symbolizes Cancer, the Western zodiac sun sign associated with the date of the story's commencement, so that's in there as well. She's wearing a red bandana, which hints that she has been wounded after an ordeal, but has mended and wears it as a badge of courage, of experience. Her eyes are cast down, appearing like they're closed. Her green book has a red key icon on the spine, the opposite of the actual book, but also revealing that beneath the dust jacket, the book is in fact green. She's got the crimson blanket with the symbol of the silver serpent embroidered on it, symbolizing her aged mother or grandmother. Her ring, Gleam, is shining, and the sun is also streaming through the window. And between the couple, there are two cups in the cup holders, secretly hinting that they've come from a celebration of some type. We also get a good look at a star-shaped tattoo on her left inner calf. Aesthetically, I always envisioned Poet as being blonde with a distinctive swoop of hair that appears like a candle flame. In this image, her swoop is not as pronounced and is a little flopped over, similar to the way like orcas, killer whales, their dorsal fins flop over when they've been in captivity, because they need deep water. Right? Makes me think of depression, or a mark that is proof that someone was incarcerated once, or a sign of past trauma. This version of her is sort of domesticated and rooted in my reality. However, her feet are bare, which shows she's got a certain amount of whimsy and carelessness to her. Her fingernails are painted red too, another allusion to the reality that she inhabits, that there's some purpose in doing that. It's not something she does throughout the story. It doesn't happen until she's become part of this sort of false reality. In the next image, we see the driver touching her pregnant belly, like reaching over, touching, while the ghostly child's apparition evolves, sporting the hair swoop now. Poet's monogram can be seen on the blanket on the other side, and the mouse can be seen on the dashboard at this point, having just entered the story. The rear view mirror and the air freshener dangling from it are purple, another color I use very symbolically throughout the story to denote potential danger. Again, it's always going to come back. This is potentially dangerous. In the background, through the window, we can see 3 children playing by a fire hydrant, repeating the Trinity theme there again. We also see the dark cloud on the horizon with a red bird-shaped blur and the red truck, which is our chariot of death barreling down the road. Of course, the distance and width of the road are distorted to show how warped our vision is through the fishbowl of our own perception. This is perhaps the only time she looks directly at the reader, and the reader is seeing through the driver's eyes. So once the child ghost is sufficiently spawned, she flies out of the car and attempts to stop the coming catastrophe. Not truly realizing what is happening, but perhaps pulling from a past life experience and knowing this is not a good thing that is about to happen. The rear view mirror reflects Poet's eyes, but they're looking off to the side at the oncoming truck, not at the mouse that she's actually looking at. And the air freshener be better seen now. Kind of saw it from an angle before, but now we see that it's an elephant with its trunk up. Normally this symbol portends good luck, but its trunk is like turning into a spiral, that spiral of entropy. And the dangerous purple color means that something more unpredictable is about to happen. Luck may be the end result, but not until after events have run their course. So the mouse takes center stage, creating the distraction that results in the accident, as though he was the bait to lure the child and to end one cycle of life to initiate another. So that's sort of like his purpose at the beginning of all this. Also why he paints the spiral. At the end of the spiral, the Redbird is now soaring above the truck as it arrives. Again, the windows distort reality as a wide globule of seemingly magical blood floats out of the nib of her red feather quill, and the first double-page spread illustration is this impactful one showing the first great tragedy of the story at the symbolic crossroads which preclude the threshold of adventure. So we see the red blur of the Redbird, who still has not been formally introduced at this point, and the shadow of the scarfish the Redbird's carrying, that symbol of spite that is now clearly depicted and shows that his spite has summoned the chariot of death to try and stop her before she has a chance to start her story. I also see the cricket there in the shadow of the star. He's making his appearance, making himself known. Yes, I'm here, come get me. The green scissors are on the truck's side, which denotes the strings being cut, the puppet strings of the unmoved mover, leaving these 2 passengers inert and severing the umbilical which attaches the phantom child to her mother. Also, if you recall, later in chapter 2, she cuts the silver cord Lukiat tries to strangle her with, which is the symbolic metaphysical thread that connects our souls to the ether as well as our souls to our physical bodies. Side note, the actual book has a book ribbon, and it's meant to echo that symbol. It's a silver book ribbon. It's the symbol of the silver cord. Silver is also a reference throughout the story to the notion of death, or of something ominous, that be it the silver fish, the silver cervid, the silver swan, etc. The truck's driver has eyes that glow red, connecting his murderous moment to the rampage she goes on in chapter 11, as well as her sort of possessed display of power while under the Ascendant's tutelage in chapter 4. Neither of them is in complete control of their faculties during these times, so it's safe to assume that the truck driver is either possessed or a manifestation of murderous rage from the Redbird, who she refers to as being the Dark Light's herald. That's a bit of misdirection. His arrival does precede Lukiat's first appearance. He is not her servant, as the term herald might suggest. He merely arrives in advance of the Dream Demon, and thereby his presence forecasts the coming of Lukiat soon after. You can also see Zeke escaping from the vehicle with Gleeman, which suggests that he stole it from her finger just before the moment of impact. Unless we're to believe that she sensed this was coming, as her narration does sort of suggest, and in that brief moment of suspended time before the moment of impact, she surrenders the ring to the mouse to give to her moonbeam, or to use to lure her away from danger, somehow knowing that it will be an effective bait. The impact jolts the car in the opposite direction physics would dictate to show the crossroads as a threshold between the real and the surreal, and we do see some Zorn glyphs on the truck, which hints at the connection to the reptilians later on. It does say a word, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to leave certain things mysterious. In fact, the Zorn font is one of them because I'm the only one who can translate it. Lastly, our ghostly child is floating front and center in this picture, feeling, she looks like she's very light and sort of insubstantial at the moment, and she watches death take away her only connection to life, leaving her alone and confused. Interestingly, Larkspur is the chapter wherein the narration changes the most, from the expectant mother to the ghostly child, and then at the beginning of chapter 2, when the phantom toddler summons the great rain and peers into her reflection, we switch one more time to a third third person, this sort of omnipresent narrator who is both me, the author, and poet's voice writing the story, and it stays that way from that point on, at least until the very, very end. So the first chapter really is enigmatic in a purposeful way, rotating between the three component parts of her being. So now we're left with this aftermath. The car is on fire, the truck is billowing purple smoke, the Redbird is flying through the dark cloud with the starfish and green lightning, and the energy of growth is crackling about this smoke-like cloud, hinting at the power of Lukiat, which is now set free and on a collision course with our protagonist. We see loose pages scattered on the breeze, these being actually the same pages of text we've already read up to this point, with some symbols sketched in the margins, which were preliminary sketches I was using while developing the designs for the seasonal glyphs. So the ghost child's pallor becomes darker as she comes in contact with the ground, becoming grounded, sitting there with this sort of despondent posture. This shows that she has become somewhat corporeal and less insubstantial than before. A single tear is shed, perhaps her first. Despite having no frame of reference for the emotional response to this tragedy, the tear looks like a silverfish or a spermatozoa swimming off to fertilize the dream and prepare for her eventual arrival. We see similar droplets in Chapter 11 spiraling down the Redbird's tail and entering Poet's star-shaped chest wound, which results in the symbolic fertilization of her as well. So it's almost as though, since she was never born, the cosmic egg that she represents, both similar shades of green by the way, remains unfertilized, and thus the sperm is rejected and the egg remains alone and unrealized. And the stop sign is a reflection of this sudden and violent nature of what has just occurred. It's very tongue-in-cheek, obviously it's too late for stopping, but the ghost child takes a moment to sit and question what's going on. Now, of course, giving the child a fully developed inner voice and vocabulary was necessary for moving the story forward, but it also hints at the notion that all of this has happened before and that this child is just the freshest version of the main character, reborn through the destruction of the old form and unleashed in that crushing moment when her mother was taken away. The moment they crossed that line, passing beyond the stop sign and entering the point of no return into the intersection between worlds. Their old forms were destroyed and new ones take their place. One being the ghost child, the other being the Redbird, as though two versions of each of these characters cannot exist within the same space, else it creates a paradox. The cricket created a paradox in the story. In fact, the cricket is a living symbol for the idea of a paradox, but we'll get back to that. For now, let's move forward. The ghostly child goes searching for Gleam, her mother's heirloom, and the bait, as I said, which the mouse has taken and is using to lure her away from the crash site and potential danger. The child searches all through the tall grass for the mouse. We see 3 different versions of her in that illustration. Again, a reference to the Trinity and the passage of time. And then she finds Zeke and knows for sure that he has the ring, so she'll not rest until she's reclaimed it. And we can see a police car going by in the background there, which hints at some semblance of reality and the consequences which this ghost child has sort of turned her back on. So next enters the Sunbear. And he's disguised as a human, standing on one side of this cautionary line that separates bystanders from those trying to clean up this tragic scene. He's wearing this shoddy disguise. This scarf that he's wearing, the red scarf, can be linked to the red bandana that Poet was wearing, denoting experience and having endured some type of ordeal. The derby and the trench coat make him look like he's sort of pretending to be a private eye, as though trying to be inconspicuous, but by trying to be inconspicuous, being more conspicuous because of his size. It's meant to be sort of silly, because he really is hiding in plain sight behind all of these unsuspecting humans watching this tragic cleanup effort. The mouse drops Gleam into Sunbear's pocket, then leaps away, and the ghostly child reclaims the ring from Sunbear, as it is her birthright. However, Sunbear tells her that he and the mouse were sent or summoned to protect her and to guide her, and of course in most cases the hero of the story is somewhat reluctant to cross the threshold into adventure, and some event pushes them in, head first. In those first difficult steps, they are never taken willingly, at least very rarely. In this case, she runs away from those who are professing to help her and crosses the line, darting past the crossroads and into a wilderness of possibilities. And when the Sunbear reveals himself, it's a shock to everyone who witnesses it. He's meant to appear both intimidating and yet sort of funny because he's not an actual threat. And of course the mouse leaps from the pages at this point, having served his purpose in this part of the tale. So in the background of this double-page spread, we see the part of the path that's already been traveled. And on the horizon, there's this shining blue city. There's that color blue again here, hinting at a place of familiarity and comfort, just like the car's interior. The moon is rising to symbolize our passage from sundown, the time of rest for those who have passed on, into the dreams of night. And the child apparition descends this hill and bounds off into the deepening wood, and we see the color purple again. And this time it's in the form of these thorny branches that are encroaching into the scene, denoting something dangerous therein. And as the child flees from the Sunbear, who keeps calling to her to stop because she's in danger of being exposed to the dreamer's perception, we see the Redbird, quite clearly now, soaring overhead and carrying the scarfish in its talons, which have been infected with silver from the painted moonlight. Soon after, her tears transform into silver fish and start splashing on the air, leaving this trail by which she can be followed. This is when we first are made aware of the way her emotions act as a sort of beacon for those who would seek to find her. The bear becomes ensnared to try and distract the glowering darkness from finding her, something he does impulsively and recklessly, displaying both his penchant for barreling through and perhaps foreshadowing the fact that he will later be a part of a threefold distraction to aid Poet in the struggle against her shadow. We can see the outline of the Redbird carrying the scarfish on the Sunbear's haunch, symbolizing where the wound will be, where the Redbird will infect the bear with that silver and transform him. It's imbued with the spite of the scarfish, hence why the Sunbear is later in this monstrous form. It's so angry and enraged. So as Lukiad is the master of these darker emotions, it enables that dark version of her to take control of the bear and use him as a weapon, much as the scarfish is used as a sentry, likewise being infected by the silver, having been carried in the Redbird's talons. So this forest appears evil, and the trees take on twisted faces to show that despite appearing green, it is a disguise to lure in potential sustenance. Sunbear remembers these woods from his childhood as having been peaceful and full of life, but now it's starving, having been neglected and forgotten for so long. This is symbolic of the fact that I started this story a very long time ago, and had to walk away from it because I was just not ready to tackle the sheer magnitude of the project yet. I had other things I wanted to work on, but I never forgot about it, so it haunted me, sort of like this forest is haunted, waiting to be reawoken. The ghostly child could fall prey to this woeful wood, and she almost does when a chokecherry tree comes to life and grabs a hold of her, tangling her up in its potentially dangerous purple roots. Sunbear tears up, and this single drop of his pure emotional response is enough to awaken the mother root. The tear carried within it pain, but also great concern for the ghost child, and that information was enough to draw the ancient golden tree up from the dreamy dirt to protect the child from what is coming, at least for the moment. And in a way, this is a reincarnation of her mother and her ancestral line, and despite being kind of ugly and knotted looking, the massive glowing hulk of a form that she takes on is still stunning to behold amid this dark forest. The mother root tries to impart some wisdom to the precocious child, and then the arrow arrives. This is the same arrow she fired through the nether in Chapter 4 to open a gateway into the infinite space between dreams, and it sailed backwards through the dream to this point of her origin, where she receives the arrow and the sprout that it bears. Now, that sprout, having been fertilized and germinated by its release through the Stargazer's lighthouse roof, this is the laughing tree, which she now plants, and its joyful essence brings the forest back from the brink of darkness and death, while the Redbird perches nearby to contradict the glowing tree and argue against everything she says. This is the Redbird's way of trying to stop this narrative before it goes any further, because he knows what's coming. He knows what the child represents and what she's going to do, so he tries to convince her of the power that she has and that she can take control of the dream. This is sort of the permission that he grants her early on as the true dreamer, and the seed he plants in her mind to make this particular version of her turn towards the darkness. So the dream demon he heralds is actually this ghostly child, and she becomes Lukiad, the antagonist, because of the Redbird's interference and suggestions. And the mother root at one point has had enough of the Redbird and just forces him away into the depths of the dream, blocking out his influence for the time being. And as he goes, he drops the scarfish into the underbrush, leaving it behind as a sentry or a spy to keep tabs on her. So all of the magic that once resided within this wood starts to return, and what was once seemingly evil becomes auspicious. So this brings us to the end of the first chapter, and the ghost, who Sunbear calls Nameless, is plucking thorns from his nose while he begins this story to lull them both to sleep. He refers to she who sleeps beyond the stars. She refuses to sing a lullaby for him because she does not know the song yet, or cannot remember it, as that is the epic poem at the story's ending. And since none of the events it speaks of have yet come to pass in this iteration, she refuses to try and remember what she has willfully forgotten through her rebirth. The laughing tree sprouts quickly, the scarfish remains close by, ever watchful, and the chapter ends with her revealing that she knows things but can't remember the details because she is brand new. Gleam represents her connection to the past, and with the start of chapter 2, we see her let go of that remnant, that artifact of the previous cycle, in order to awaken her other self on the other side of the dream barrier, which was supposedly constructed by her mother. Also, a cricket chirps, showing that particular creature that the Redbird is chasing is here, hiding and being elusive. The cricket symbolizes that tiny, nagging voice calling me to creativity. And also, while I was recording these videos, I had a cricket friend accompanying me, many nights who I did battle with to get it to be quiet long enough for me to record. And there were times the cricket was not an artificial sound effect at all, and I just let it be because why the heck not? It's making its role in the story that much more obvious and humorous to me. So there are times when you'll hear a cricket on the recordings, and sometimes it was intentional and other times it was not. So, pretty funny. Chapter 2, Gladiola. So Sunbear's infected wound makes him weep, and the tears create this puddle that signifies how our emotional responses can reflect back to us who we truly are. The deep wound cannot be healed by Gleam, as the power of dream stars is as of yet undefined and sort of vaguely fluctuant. So perhaps some part of her is actually choosing not to heal this wound because it serves a purpose for her later on. She chooses to peer into a pool of water to see her own reflection and give herself an identity, and at this point we see the brighter green version of her, the Lukiot version of her as a child, who reaches through the portal of reflection to demand that she drop the ruby ring into the pool, which she does, without question. Then she feels empowered by her sense of identity, and proceeds to call down this great flood of tears that drowns the surrounding world and eventually makes this site into an island called the Southern Triangle. And it is at this point that we might recognize and realize that the ghost child we were following was not necessarily Poet. It may have been Lukiot, revisiting her origin and trying to change things, as Sophia says she's been doing in Chapter 9. Or was it the interference of the Redbird that separated her consciousness and created the dream demon in the first place? Which we could argue that that is the case since I'm the author and I made these decisions, so yeah, in a way that is what was happening there. So both are reasonable explanations. I'll leave it up to you to decide which you prefer. Did you catch the silver servant in the background on that first illustration of Chapter 2? She's always there in the background, checking up on things and reminding us of her connection to the divine through the specter of death. Is it a good or a bad omen? Perhaps neither, but an omen nonetheless. So backtrack just a minute. So Chapter 2 is called Our Eternal Dance because this is the lazy floating waltz that sets up the rest of the story and gives us an established protagonist and antagonist. They've done this dance before and will no doubt do it again, moving back and forth between the solstices and equinoxes, one rising to power while the other diminishes, one chasing or hunting while the other flees and hides, biding time until the next seasonal shift. So we leap forward to where the first person narration shifts to a third person as though she is now observing herself from outside of herself, or the narrator interrupts upon sacrificing Gleam to the depths of the dream and becomes the primary narrator and voice for the whole story. So Gleam arrives on the finger of our protagonist, who awakens from a nightmare about this great flood, showing a subconscious connection to what we just witnessed, but leaving what actually happened there a mystery for our own imaginations to fill in the gaps. Our first look at her is of her in her bedroom, waking up startled, and her bedroom is just chock full of all manner of hints and symbols and bits of foreshadowing. There's hearts and stars, which are repeated shapes throughout the tale. The flowers of each month are displayed as little sketches in the wallpaper border around the ceiling. She has a blue nightlight that resembles Stargazer's lantern. The gladiola flower for this particular chapter is in a vase on her bedside table, as well as a very blurry, indistinct picture of her mother in a red frame. The cricket's there, looking rather large. The scarf and the derby of the Sunbear are hanging on one bedpost. The center of the bed frame head is the symbol of the season of summer. And there's a mouse hole under the bedside table. There's a poster of a purple dragon looking a bit like the Ascendant behind her bed. There's carvings in her bed frame. There's a lizard, a monkey, and a winged lion with a gemstone, all obvious connections to the coming chapters. Also, the coyote and the cervid are on the crest of the bottom part of the frame. She has a couple of stuffed animals. There's a fox and a bear with her, being Sunbear and Penumbra. There's a seahorse decoration on the wall and a poster of a figure holding something, perhaps the prismatic fruit which enlightens her, as the figure has a purple halo, making it appear divine, though again the purple suggests potential danger. There's a green key atop her bookshelf, and each of the books on the shelf has a word or an initials on it. They're all things that have inspired me and played a role in this story's creation. I won't say what any of them are. If you want to zoom in super close, you might be able to read some of them, but I kind of made them hard to read. There's a chunk of coral repeated from the borders, also foreshadowing the environmental shift that's coming. There's a lute, which is Lukiat's instrument of choice. There's a toy box with a stuffed sloth hanging out of it. At this point, he's blue and sort of lifeless in appearance to show that he's not yet been introduced, nor will he be for some time, and also foreshadowing his eventual death. We can see the Redbird outside of the window as the sun shines through. There's a goblet, like the one that the two passengers had between them in Chapter 1, on the floor beside the bed. And then on her desk, we see some loose pages of writing. There's an archer sculpture with a green bow and quiver. There's the red feather quill, a blue bowl full of dream stars, little gems. There's a sash with the word queen on it, and a tiara on the other side with red, green, and blue gems in it. The three symbols, blossom, seed, and fruit on the chair backing are there again repeated. And then her fish grouper is there floating under the light and warmth of a desk lamp. And the fishbowl decorations, there's a sunken boat with two fish on the bow symbolizing the Pisces. There's a starfish, of course, and then there's the fishnet for cleaning the bowl, which is green, much like the hook Lukiat will manifest to drag her into this dream. And then finally, I even put the tarot D on her desk to reference my previous creation and its connection to this story's mythology. The three cards that are on the table being displayed are the Fool, the Tower, and the Empress, being the empty vessel at the start of a great journey, the calamity of the Tower, but also being set free from prison, and the Empress being symbolically associated with Mother Nature. So she's sitting up, startled by her nightmare, and gleam is shining on her finger, and she crosses the first of three thresholds by entering her bathroom upon feeling ill. Now, the bathroom is mostly blue, but the mirror glows green, and above the mirror we see the purple spiral symbol again. And as she uses the green scissors to cut silver strands from her hair that hint at mortality and eventual death, they become the silver fish, which alerts Lukiat to her location, and hence her shadow comes through the mirror and pulls her into the dream. And the mirror is the second threshold that she crosses. So now she's in limbo, like this fish on a hook, baited by her nightmare and her ill feelings into the trap that Lukiat set for her, or perhaps that she set for herself. And she's floating through this purple vortex, surrounded by the silver stream, and Lukiat faces her and gives her the symbolic while also dismissive moniker of She, which Poet must answer to until recovering her true name. The scissors followed her into the vortex as a useful tool to separate her from the silver cord that Lukiat tries to ensnare her with. Also, the dragonfly appears now, sent by the Mother of Trees, this symbol of change, adaptability, and self-realization. It's a fitting first character for her to meet, if only briefly, before starting her journey, being that it comes on behalf of the Finger of Fate. It's an enigmatic symbol that points the way, for better or for worse, towards the next step in the process of our spiritual evolution. The dragonfly zipping along on that path and sort of pushes her forward and then returns to bring her back later on. So we see the connection between the Golden Mother and her orchard of peaceful trees, surrounded by silver streams that both nourish and bleed from these trees, so that life and death are inextricably interwoven and connected through the ether. And Poet uses the auspicious yet discordant scissors to cut the silver cord, release herself unto the dream, and then Lukiat shifts into the form of this black bird, which was, by the way, also hinted at and hidden behind the neck of the lute sitting on one of her shelves, the bookshelf in her bedroom. Blackbirds are intelligent and ominous. They symbolize wisdom, as well as the ability to traverse the nether regions and pass through dimensional portals to carry messages from beyond. So she uses the scissors to separate herself from Lukiat and to wound the shadow, while racing towards the final threshold of 3, the membrane in the clouds, which the dragonfly helps her to pass through. It appears as a mandorla, a sacred symbol, like a mother's womb or the birth canal. This light on the other side, which also suggests an eye that is opening and awakening, and it's sideways because the person who the eye belongs to is lying down asleep until now. So she is birthed into the dream thereby and falls through the air, which is her first step in refinement by way of these elements. and then she plunges into the ocean, water being the second step on her path of refinement. She enters where there is a star-shaped reflection on the water, which means upon entry the starfish from chapter 1 will be alerted to her presence and can then send out an underwater ping like a submarine to let Lukiat know where to find her. Now Lukiat may have been wounded by the scissors, which landed in her avian form's left wing, but the wound does not show. It's more of like a balancing metaphor for the wound already received by their separation by way of their mother, and it's connected to the eventual wound on Poet's left calf, which she will not receive until chapter 9. So she sinks into the dark waters all the way to the bottom, while the scarfish follows her down, and the coral expanse is full of bright creatures, including the seahorse, who she does not have a chance to meet until chapter 5. And then the grouper appears. Big purple fish. Yes, a potentially dangerous creature, but not necessarily evil. Its headlamp is reminiscent of her desk lamp, and the creature is a mashup of an anglerfish and a lionfish. The anglerfish with headlamps, those are expressly female, by the way. They do all the hunting. She recognizes this creature despite not looking exactly like her quote-unquote wet pet, because there are still remnants of her supposedly waking life making themselves known to her here, suggesting it's all just a dream and that her subconscious has constructed this from her true reality. We see the scarfish send out its green sound wave calling upon the beast, playing the role it was left here to play by the Redbird, who, by this rationale, seems to be intent on helping Lukiat. Or maybe he didn't realize the monster he would create by meddling with things he has little to no power over. That is a metaphor for me trying to subvert and derail my own attempts at bringing this creation to life. Her ruby ring, the heirloom passed down through generations of women in her family, carried a heavy burden with it, so she sinks, but it also gives her unnatural powers, like the transformation that now ensues when she grows a mermaid tail. It's like blood symbolizing that by aging as she passed through the mirror, she also went through puberty, and this symbolic blood that eventually becomes her cloak symbolized menarche, so the first period, and her fruition into young womanhood. So still a child in mind, but mature enough in body to endure the trials that she's about to go through. This sacred blood of passage and maturity is also a way of protecting her against the elements and against Lukiat's attacks. Blood magic can be very powerful, and this is blood magic in its purest form. She swims away, avoiding the snare of silverfish in Lukiat's thrall, and as she comes cruising in the form of a giant shark, big mouthful of teeth, it's the Hellmouth, trying to devour her. It's a trope before she can even start her real journey into oblivion. Just get rid of her, erase her from time. And she's at her most vulnerable right now. She's lost in the ocean. But Gleam gives her the strength to carry on. Grouper uses the light of a dream star to help her, attacking Lukiat's beastly form, and despite being devoured, Gleam's power forces Lukiat to become beached and spew Poet out of her mouth. She has more power right now than Lukiat does, according to the solstices and equinoxes. So Lukiat is temporarily defeated and recollects in the form of a two-eyed storm that comes rolling in towards the island that she's found sanctuary on. Her fishtail turns back into legs, and the sacred blood from her ruby heirloom reforms into a cloak. She looks over and sees the devastation up and down the beach. She's just like, oh man, what have I done? So this is the first hint that she's a destructive and creative force, and her presence here is just going to cause a lot of suffering. And before dying, Grouper entrusts to her her second dream star, which, paired with her ruby, augments her power and creates the first seasonal sigil on her frock. The entire second chapter is sort of like this aggressive argument and chase, like a choreographed dance, hence the title. So now we can get down to business. Chapter 3, Aster, takes place completely on the southern triangle island. The triangular shape denotes a trinity, as well as the 2D symbol for a tetrahedron, the platonic symbol of fire. So now that she has made landfall and come into contact with Earth, her third elemental refinement is complete, and then once Lukiat unleashes lightning from the two-eyed storm, this symbolic form of energy and therefore fire, she is fire-hardened and attains a level of power unbeknownst to her, though she can feel it. She is fire-hardened, as the text puts it, and thus her first complete refinement has been reached, because she's passed through all four elements at that point. There's even a little torch in the background of that illustration of her cloak sort of forming to reinforce this notion. Also, the silver cervid can be seen on the beach in the far distance, real tiny there again. So now we step away from her story briefly to meet the kestrel and the coyote, and we only veer this far away from her involvement one other time in the story during chapter 10, so they must be pretty important, Kestrel and Coyote are both sort of in the know about Poet and Lukiat, so they're waiting and ready for what's about to come, or perhaps not so ready as they imagine. Both of them seem to be enigmatically aware of things that have transpired before, and even hint through their brief conversation that this is just another iteration of a story they've both participated in previously. The Coyote is representative of a friend of mine who died by suicide at a young age, and thus the first death from within the dream is his, and it is symbolic and seemingly a waste of a character, but in fact this death is very meaningful and set in motion all manner of events that are inextricably linked to my personal life. And it was way back when that occurred, when I was first started writing this story. I was writing this right before that, and it was his death that sort of integrated itself into the tale because it was so tragic and impactful that it changed my and many other people's lives at the time. Coyote's sort of happy-go-lucky and selfless. He chooses to sacrifice himself to help Kestrel escape and go find her, but because he's overcome with the silver sadness, he's sort of infected by these silver fish which are coming from the two-eyed storm of Lukiat's manifestation. He leaps to his death onto a green stone surrounded by flowers. So it's like a shrine or a grave site. And Kestrel is overcome with emotion, so instead of running away, he turns back and does battle with the storm, which takes a new form. This mischievous, fairy-looking, sort of alien, strange, disturbing creature. And this is when we see an animal change into a human form for the first time in the story, which is extremely rare within the dream. It denotes great power and importance. Stargazer is his new form, and he uses his batang staff and his blue lantern to do wizardly battle with the green demon. He calls him father, because in a way he is. If the Redbird had not interfered, perhaps Lukiat would never have been created. And while all of this is happening, she's off romping around. He's over here fighting and she's having a good time, so he is the distraction currently, and Lukiat's coming after him. And that is, in a way, a metaphor. My battle with the story itself. And bringing it into being, because yes, in a way I am its father and its mother, but in a way I'm not. I was sort of listening to my imagination and letting it decide for me. So, she's off, like I said, she's romping about the island, having a good time in her new attire, remembering her grandmother, drawing these symbols of protection on her, and that references the finger of fate once again, and her grandmother's link to the golden tree. There's this theme of familial heritage and traditions throughout the story. At this point in time, the drops of rain are purple, denoting potential danger, but also becoming silver fish upon touching the flesh of a living creature. So they're definitely pretty dangerous. The symbol of the blue lighthouse is obviously phallic. Again, in the binary language, that is reproduction. The ones and the zeros are sperm and egg. But this is more about reproduction than anything, physical, biological reproduction. And that being the case, it's a very deliberately male spectacle, despite the matriarchal nature of this story. So if I were to relate them to both Freudian and Jungian psychological symbols, she is my Jungian anima, and Stargazer is my animus. And since I've given her a complete persona, a psyche, if you will, she has a Freudian id, ego, and superego, each represented by her disparate parts. Likewise, the Stargazer is part Kestrel, part Albatross, and part Cobra, all eventually combining into the Redbird at her behest, negating his secondary layer of psyche because she has seen through the veneer of his disguise and knows that he is the dreamer by the end of the 11th chapter. So many examples of threes throughout. And once the Stargazer becomes the Redbird, there is only one instead of three, because two can never be, as the rhyme goes. That is why the cricket represents the paradox, because while there is one cricket, but it exists twice in the same time, overlapping and creating this confounding loop in the procession. It was intentionally used to create a plot hole that the dreamer cannot repair, but will likely chase after perpetually in an attempt to. And the nice thing about dreams, since they don't have to make sense, is we can just do whatever we want with them. But when you're writing a story, despite it being on the subject of something that doesn't have to make sense, your temporal sensibilities will be to actually make sense of it. So chasing the cricket is inevitable, and that's what that symbol means. So I'm certain there are those who have tried to read the story and get lost trying to make sense of it instead of just allowing it to play out and not ask questions until it's all been said and done. Because you're giving up control to the author and letting them dictate. You're supposed to do that. You're supposed to put your hands up, let the artist take you where they want to take you. And there's a certain impatience with people and their desperate need to make sense of everything right away. And so I purposefully purposefully made this story enigmatic and cyclical so that it left readers confused for the sake of forcing them to just relax and let the story take them where it wants to. Sometimes you have to surrender, let your desperate need for control just go, and just allow the joy that comes from being in the moment envelop you. It's a hard lesson, even for me, but at least I'm aware enough of it to make the cricket a flashpoint for that realization and the symbol for life's conundrum of potential meaninglessness and meaningfulness at the same time. So I hope you got that from it and that maybe you were able to sort of let go, just let it be what it is. So then we see the snail. The snail's got a very brief but an incredibly important part in this story, at least for me. The snail tells her to slow it down, live in the moment, which for a little bit, just a little bit, she does, and she seems pretty happy. And it was at this point I needed to tell myself, I've got a long way to go on this story, but I'll get there eventually, no matter how slow my progress, as long as I stay focused and just live in the moment. And a lot of these characters show up to give me that kind of advice that I needed while I was creating the book, and their words still resonate. So she encounters the statue of the bull for the first time here, foreshadowing what is yet to come. And then shortly after, she finds Speartooth, this Ouroboros, this ancient depiction of a serpent eating its tail, but in this case it's two-headed, so it's trying to eat its other head. Another allegory for the notion of infinity and the perpetuation of time, and a take on a much simpler spiral, but maybe a more mythological take on it. These conjoined reptiles are also sort of the yin and yang energies, or the devil and the angel of our conscience, one on each shoulder, which she has the bow strapped to her back, kind of looks like there's a head on each side, suggesting what we might do next. They speak as one, but are also distinctly different in appearance. They eat her dream stars because she has used the portion of their power that is available to her already, and at this point they're really only useful to Speartooth because that's what Speartooth feeds on, and this makes the dual serpent become her first weapon. Out of respect and out of gratitude, it becomes her bow. And Speartooth's backstory is kind of complicated, and we'll talk more about it when we get to chapter 7. But in the meantime, upon realizing that this bow is not going to be any good to her without arrows, that's when the laughing tree makes its presence known, as if she asked for it and her dream came true. And the laughing tree offers her this quiver of living arrows. Meanwhile, Stargazer's battle isn't going very well, so he's got to flee, and he transforms back into his kestrel form. And the visual representation of his transformative magic are these primary triad yellow, red, and blue and overlapping rectangles, which is this sort of nod to Piet Mondrian's Der Stil, and a German art movement focused on the simplicity of color and shape. And since the kestrel is Stargazer's simpler form, and just one of the disguises that he uses, and a somewhat pretentious one at that, believing that he knows all there is to know and can thereby create something definitive based on that limited knowledge and control all of this nonsense that's going on, I thought this reference made a lot of sense. It's also how I feel about the essential nature of this symbolic fairy tale that I'm telling, that no matter how much I want it to feel definitive, it's just another reinterpretation of the basics. And I did my best to keep it simple, but there is some complexity within that simplicity. So Kestrel manages to evade the dream demon for now to go in search of her, and Lukiat turns back at the two-eyed storm and lurks through the island forest like this murky mist. And we can see the southern triangle from a distance. We also see 3 pillars of steam rising out of the ocean, which we know later on are the vents that expel steam from the as-of-yet hidden metropolis of Zorn. So there's some more foreshadowing there. Back with Poet, we see how large the laughing tree is now. The last time we saw it, it was just a sapling. So much time has clearly passed. Penumbra makes her first appearance now and becomes her faithful friend and steed. I mean, come on, riding on the back of a giant bat-eared fox has to be pretty cool, right? Penumbra is sharp and slick and lovely, as well as somewhat mysterious. Penumbra is essentially Poet's Vahana, which is a Sanskrit word meaning that which pulls or carries, so it's her vehicle, if you will, and her mount, displaying characteristics of the rider, and is often a more simplified or even purer version of the attributes that the rider displays. Penumbra is an extension of her, at her very best, but at this point they are just getting to know each other despite a sense of kinship and belonging from the very start, and then comes the Shadow, the big, black, monstrous version of the Sunbear, who succumbed to the Shadow to Lukiat after being infected with silver. After many years of torment, this is what is left of the Sunbear, this monstrosity that she does recognize as being her stuffed bear from her childhood, in a similar way that she recognized, grouper. Even though it doesn't look like a goldfish, it reminded her of her fish back home. Penumbra instructs her on the use of the sacred arrows from the Laughing Tree and all of their divine properties, which she mostly uses them for at one point in time or another. Of course, Lukiat, being a component of her being, is able to withstand them, as can Frith Marak, one of Stargazer's alter egos. Otherwise, they're very useful tools, each one its own message, its own spell. So they are chased through the woods by this demon bear, and all the while she's conflicted about slaying the beast with one of these arrows because of her connection to it. And this shows that she has a big heart, despite finally letting the arrow fly. And she is remorseful for bringing the beast down, and it is this mercy and empathy that affords her the right to claim these arrows for her own. So she's passed a big test of character in the 3rd chapter. Sunbear is healed by the arrow, but he's been under the demon spell for so long that he just seems to cry himself to sleep and then die, as his larger, more menacing form sort of melts away. And at this moment, Lukiat begins to manifest, taking on a form very similar to her own, as though it was waiting to see how things went before stepping back into the picture, again hinting at the fact that she's less powerful during this season. Being inexperienced and unprepared to do battle with her shadow, she is suddenly and unceremoniously snatched up by the Kestrel, who takes her to the Stargazer's lighthouse without consideration for Penumbra at all, leaving the fox behind. And we could write this off as him seeing Hoet as being the priority, and Penumbra just another animal allegory. He sees now the error in his meddling, in his inadvertent creation of Lukiat, which resulted in the coyote's death. And now she is here, and so he must make her ready to do battle with and potentially defeat the Dream Demon, because he can't. Else things will just go, from bad to worse, so he's got to have her do it. And he realizes this because he's been through all of this before. And at this point we can assume if he has been through all of this before, that this is the best option he can think of to counteract what's happening. So he gives her his dream star from his lantern, smaller version of the lighthouse obviously, in which he resides, and beckons her to come inside the structure, which is his sanctuary, a world between worlds, where he can decide her next course of action to repair what may already be beyond his power to control. So at the end of the Summer Shard, there's this definitive ending to the action. There's a hint of what's to come, and as a whole we could look at the 3 chapters thus far as being an introduction to the world, this sort of sudden and jarring loss that pushes our potential hero across the threshold and into the hero's journey, as outlined by the preeminent mythologist Joseph Campbell. The first steps are frightening and confusing, but there are mentors and helpers along the way to give advice and help out when it's needed. And then there's the introduction to the main antagonist. An argument ensues, and there's this sort of temporary resolution. There's a desperate chase, some special powers are revealed, abilities are discovered, there's some exploration of other themes throughout, and then a few new side characters pop up to support the story and stretch it out so that we can see what's beyond the fringes of the narrative. And then there's this final conclusive confrontation full of energy and excitement, and then finally a promise of further revelations to come. The Summer Shard is the shortest one. Each chapter gets a little longer as it goes. I've always felt like summer just kind of blows right by, because I'm always outside enjoying it so much. I'm always sad to see it go. But the nice thing about autumn is that some of the summer feelings still linger until the last leaves have fallen. So next, let's talk about the Autumn Shard. So we start the Autumn Shard as we did the Summer Shard, with the stained glass windows and a preface read in that slithering voice, dropping more hints about the identity and the current state of her dreaming mind. And then we enter Chapter 4, which is Marigold. The inside of the lighthouse is blue and familiar, as it is my sanctuary. We see the silver servant as a statue on the way up the spiral stair, and the study on the top floor is sort of like my little corner of eternity, this safe space within my imagination where I can escape and muse to myself without interference. The cricket is in the lighthouse, tormenting Stargazer with its incessant chirping. Stargazer peers out his window to the universe through his spyglass, which is another phallic symbol like the lighthouse is, declaring his masculine energy and his dictatorial power within the dream. We see a portrait of the cobra and the albatross there. Again, the cricket is also present. The symbol of the moon is in the upper right corner, which foreshadows the abstracted form that the moon will later take on in this chapter. There's also a beaker with some purple liquid in it on a table on the far side of the room, which might suggest Nyxerva, perhaps. We see that Poet's triune nature glyph on her back is really prominent and powerful, even though the Stargazer is unsure of its meaning. He can be short-sighted sometimes and miss the most obvious things because he tends to look a little too deep into things at times, kind of obsessively, evidenced by his need to stare out the window across the universe. And we can just barely, if we look, make out the finch flying around outside. And by the time we meet the finch formally in Chapter 8, he will have eaten the cricket that is tormenting the Stargazer in his lighthouse. That's its hiding place currently. And after Stargazer instructs Poet to use her bow and arrows empowered by a trinity of dream stars to open a portal in the clouds so that he can send her to attend school with his former teacher and learn from the Ascendant, he waves his hand about and casts a spell under his breath to enhance the magic of her arrow. And this is sort of how the seed of the laughing tree is germinated from one of its own arrows and sent back in time to be received and then planted by the ghostly child. There is a portrait of a redbird on the wall beside the portrait of the cobra and albatross. We couldn't see it before, but after hearing the spell he cast and the slithering voice he used to cast it, the hint of what is to come is that much more apparent, despite the fact that in terms of the timeline, it doesn't make sense that he would even be aware of that yet. But again, it's a dream, and it's happened many times before, though I did not outright say it was Stargazer who cast the spell at the time, but in retrospect we know that it is true, because we've heard the voice and then we hear his voice in Chapter 12. So he fertilized the arrow's seed, just as he fertilizes her womb in Chapter 11, and both of these moments result in someone flying through the ceiling. And yes, it is a metaphor for the moment of climax, shooting like a rocket into space. We also notice that the quill pen is a blue feather on the Stargazer's desk beside a red tone, with the drawing of the cricket on one of its pages. So things are a little bit opposite there of what she had in Chapter 1, but still related to the same objects and notions. There's also a baptismal font in the room that symbolizes Stargazer's priestly nature, being sort of this spiritual guru of the dream. And lastly, the coffered ceilings, though primarily decorative, do improve acoustics, deadening outside noise and amplifying the sound within, which would be optimal for uninterrupted spellcasting. Stargazer's lantern continues to change shape and style, and despite having given her his dream star, the lantern still blazes forth blue light. No one questions this, but the reasoning is Stargazer knows that the dream stars are only as important as the one who possesses it once, so he probably had quite a few spares lying around, so he just sort of surreptitiously replaced it and never said another word about it. Stargazer's a shady guy. So she's whisked up on this whirlwind into the cloudy realm where she encounters the Ascendant, this kingly purple dragon, and yes, he's purple because he's potentially quite dangerous. We see the abstracted moon and a series of waterfalls descending from below this luminant orb. There are scarlet-breasted or lilac-breasted rollers everywhere, dodging the bolts of lightning that the dragon's spitting. These birds are exceptionally acrobatic. You can't tell the difference between males and females either. They look pretty much the same. Symbolically, the 8 different colors that they normally sport are indicative of many diverse tribes of East Africa. That's where the bird is from. It's also symbolic of love and marriage. Its feathers are used in wedding dresses or even in wedding rings. And they're also considered a symbol of peace. So all of this sort of foreshadows this deep library of cultural knowledge that they are protecting and that she is soon to unlock, connecting the diversity of meaning that they represent to this endless variety of the world's stories that she's been obsessed with. So the Ascendant has both feathered and scaled wings. This feathery mane, horns, and a grand crown with glowing coronets has elements of both European and Chinese dragons with its hooked beak and claws, like the heraldic dragons or wyverns, but also this flowing mustache and beard and a serpentine body making him look like a Chinese dragon. So he's somewhere in between. And the temple has this big bell for announcing that school's in session. Of course, the pagan moon trifold symbol, a pretty famous symbol, is on the door. It actually symbolizes the mother, maiden, and crone, and they're coming together to symbolize this goddess power. And this is our first hint that the temple is directly related to her, as her triune symbol is sort of a reinterpretation of that symbol. We also see a lizard and a monkey, and the monkey's got a gear and hammer at each side of the stairs respectively. There's also 4 animals symbolizing 4 virtues on the sides of the stairs. So you've got the owl, which has an egg of wisdom. You've got the cobra, related to intellect. The frog is equilibrium, as they are indicator species, meaning that science observes them directly to determine the relative health of an entire environment, and a squirrel that denotes industriousness, related to the notion that they accidentally plant a lot of trees because they bury their acorns that they collect and then they forget about. So you've got air, fire, water, and earth attributed to these animals respectively. There's also 4 bowls of fire in the background on pillars with this symbol on them that appears sort of like a broken infinity symbol. This is actually a Celtic druidic symbol called the double spiral, which denotes a balance of opposites between life and death, creation and destruction, what is real and what is imaginary. And later on, the Stargazer sports this symbol on his forehead. She's not afraid of this dragon. Despite his terrifying size and potentially dangerous nature, she, being a lover of myth and fairy tales, loves the idea of dragons. So the Ascendant tries to be intimidating, but it just doesn't work. Probably because of the fantastical nature of what he represents. And at this point, it has become apparent that her feet are swathed in wispy air, making her able to walk on the clouds. So perhaps the spell Stargazer secretly cast also added something to her passageway that attached itself to her ankles, or maybe it's just an aspect of her arrow's power. Either way, it's a new development. When she meditates on the temple steps, a storm cloud appears above her head. For her memories are troubling and tempestuous and ominous, and this is how she purges herself of them. With one eye open and one closed, she's symbolically standing at the convergence of 2 realms, the past and the present. And upon closing both eyes, she's transported back in time through her memories, recalling an argument her parents had one night that woke her like a bad dream, which is also an argument that is referenced later on in the 12th chapter. So that actually, there is a full circle there as well. She recalls her grandmother's death, someone she loved very much. It says "going home." It's the phrase inside the coffin, which also becomes the refrain of her epic poem in chapter 13. And then she's punching Bully Butch, unleashing her anger, her fear, her sadness. All of these different emotions have worked together and against her and can lure out the dark light, and they're all shown and represented on that one side of that double-page illustration. Meanwhile, her physical body is enduring trials and training under the guidance of the Ascendant, while in this sort of trance-like state. She's doing battle both internally and externally in order to grow and mature, but doing them separately. We see the pagan symbol of the goddess again at the peak of her power. We also see an hourglass, which represents the relentless passage of time that does not occur here in the clouds for whatever reasons. Time doesn't really seem to happen here, and that's why these 5 years of meditation seems like a blink to the Ascendant. However, by leaving her physical body behind and going into the temporal realm with her mind, her body ages, so upon waking she is more of a young adult. She is permitted entrance to the temple after her meditation, and her monogram appears on the spiraling light of the opening doors, as though her meditation upon the steps sort of drew out all the information from her subconscious mind and filled these shelves of this vast library. And the library is her reference room. It's full of all these things that have inspired her. Every myth, every fairy tale, every fable, from every culture she's ever encountered and been inspired by. The diversity of the bird species in here symbolizes the wealth of heritage and the freedom to learn about and revel in all, despite your own personal cultural upbringing. The carpet displays symbols. There's these 5 overlapping circles denoting the connectivity of these divergent cultures, despite the distance between them, both physically and philosophically. But it's also a Celtic symbol of the 5 elements: fire, earth, air, water, and spirit. The symbol behind her is a Native American sun symbol that also signifies warmth, light, and growth, coinciding with the notions of comfort, knowledge, and maturation that the books in this library represent in terms of her personal development. And we see this cloud tiger that she fought while she was in her meditative trance. It's a symbol of ferocity and courage. And then we find out about the Ascendant's backstory and why he can be considered quite dangerous. We see some spaceships destroying planets that we can assume might have been the Ascendant's home. There's beheaded kings and people fleeing from this monster. We see the dragon laying waste to entire civilizations, and finally we see a previous temple built by the Ascendant long ago, and surrounding it are all of the students who failed to meet his expectations. The one kneeling before him, who's the only one who doesn't appear dead, conspicuously looks kind of like the Stargazer. So perhaps he made an exception with him, or perhaps there's more to that story than we will ever know. And I like this idea. I wanted that to be something enigmatic. There's this little mystery behind the Stargazer being acquainted with the Ascendant and what their relationship actually is. They certainly share certain traits, in particular their blue, wispy facial hair. So you decide if the Ascendant is just another version of the Stargazer. He could be the grandpa if Stargazer's the dad, maybe. Her empathy for the Ascendant is noteworthy. She doesn't show quite the same type of consideration for Marcius later in the story, whose crimes may be comparable, maybe not even as extreme, since I think Ascendant did say he took, 10 times 10,000 lives, so. This shows that by then Poet has sort of changed her mind about some things. So the avian altar, from which the unadulterated blade Pusaka is born, is indicative of the freedom associated with birds, as well as their attribute of being messengers. The term Pusaka is a Sanskrit word that means heirloom or treasure, which it certainly is. And according to certain Malaysian and Indonesian beliefs, these Pusakas are passed down from ancestors and are to be protected, and they have supernatural abilities. The person who possesses the Pusaka will be affected by its power in any number of unpredictable ways. Its power is relative to the intention of the user, and vice versa. So this sacred object has a soul of its own, but it requires someone to wield it for it to reach its full potential. She's offered this blade here because this temple is one dedicated to her, learned self, and all that she loves and respects and is fascinated by in the real world. It's connected to her intellect, as swords are often associated with the element of air and the ability to cut through what is insubstantial to find the truth. The sword is truth. And the truth is, I'm very inspired by many cultural icons and belief systems, both philosophically and aesthetically. I respect them greatly, though I don't practice any of them. I'm just fascinated by the stories. So it made sense to give the sword this name. It also eventually becomes a feather, so having these birds present seems sort of fitting. While the Ascendant claims this sword was forged using heavenly metals like perhaps the dream stars were used, and that it was made by griffins and dragons and imbued with all of this magical power, however, we know that the feather it is transformed into by Frith Marak is supposedly a single drop of his blood dedicated to the work at hand, writing the story. So perhaps he donated this drop of blood to the smithies of the Eastern Diamond constellation long, long ago. Maybe that's the scene we're seeing where the Ascendant's about to stab him, but maybe he just takes one drop of blood and uses that to create Pusaka. That's possible. But I like leaving that to the fringes, the mystery of possibility. If that's the case, it happened before anyone knew who he was. That's just another mystery linked to the Ascendant and to the Stargazer. Good teachers always inspire you to ask more questions about the things you want to know about. The blade is red and barbed to show its power and passion, and a barbed blade signifies great magical power. It's an adaptation of a kris dagger. It's a spiritual weapon that comes from Southeast Asia and Javanese cultures. The handguard is a crescent shape pointing downward, which is actually another symbol for the goddess. And then the curved hilt is meant to offer more variety and flexibility in attacking and defending. It just looks kind of cool. So that's why I designed it that way. The temple's Latin name, Stella Puera, which translates to Star Child, is also her middle name, which she finds out later, for she is a child born of the Dream Star story. She's this brilliant lamp in the darkness. The temple is hers because it is constructed from within by her mind's obsessions and interests that have inspired her all of her life. And we're going to see another library in Chapter 7, which that one is more the stories that are a result of these inspirations. So while this library is her intellect, that one is her creativity. That's why she kind of prefers it to this one. As useful as this was, that one's her library. This one's her repository, I guess we could say. Upon holding this powerful weapon, Pusaka, aloft, she imbues it with her power. So we see her monogram appear, and it also exchanges some energy with her. We see the Ascendant exiting through the back vestibule, despite its clearly not being large enough to accommodate him. Now, that's a little wink to the impossibility of everything in the dream and how things continue to change form and shape to fit the narrative as I see fit. And the back window gives us a view of the waterfalls beside which this ominous silver servant, yet again, is waiting, just peering through the windows, kind of like creeping around. Redbird does the same thing. Her sword bursts into flames upon her first real use of it, showing how powerful they are together, and also showing that her attire still is kind of linked and suggests the season of fire from the previous shard. Upon being asked to sacrifice the Ascendant and take his purple heart for her own, she does so reluctantly, symbolically taking the life of her teacher, put him to rest to give her more power. So if you remember the interior of the blue car in Chapter 1, it's all hearts and dragons. So here they are again together. It's necessary and a test of her fortitude and willingness to listen to her mentor and follow his orders, despite how strange they may seem or how uncomfortable they may make her. She seems quite sad about it, and then, she drinks the celestial water containing his blood, and her fire-hardened frock takes on the characteristics of dragon scales. And then she runs off in pursuit of the silver serpent, who has become a silver fish, very conspicuous, odd, so she knows it must be meaningful, so she goes on a hunt for it. Her destiny is the Canyon of Clouds. She just spent 5 years out of time training and preparing for what is about to transpire. She's off to meet her nemesis, and so following the silver creature is this reinforcement of the notion that she is in pursuit of and hunting her fate. Chapter 5 is Chrysanthemum, and she's headed for the Canyon of Clouds, conversing with Spiritooth along the way, and it's during this little back and forth conversation that they have that we realize that she's skeptical, maybe even a little resentful about the way certain things have gone, and she's sort of stoking her anger and frustration. After a stern talking to, Spiritooth kind of puts her in her place, and she professes that she does in fact believe in and hope for happily ever after. She wants a happy ending, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The lunar eclipse is coming, and the Ascendant had mentioned to her that this would be the height of her power. The dragon also clued her in on the meaning of her triune symbol, and that it means her. It is her symbol. Sometimes the simplest answers are the right ones. Stargazer just always complicates things. Speaking of symbols, since the season has changed, the symbols on the upper left and bottom right of each illustrative page have changed to reflect the autumn shift. Also, the symbol in the bottom left has changed from the blossom to the seed of the nature trinity. The blossom symbolized the maiden, so now we've come out of that portion, and now the seed represents the mother. And fittingly, this chapter is titled Our Mother's Blessing because Lucia reveals to Poet the supposed truth about their connection and how their mother essentially murdered Lucia to save the life of Poet, being that they were conjoined, and if separated, one of them would have to perish. Whether or not that's true, obviously, she's not sure about, but it is a revelation. So Poet's boots of leaping have sprouted full-on wings now, which enable her to traverse the cloudy realm pretty easily. We do see blue phantoms of the Sunbear and Penumbra haunting the eerie woods on the outskirts of the canyon. They're blue again, that symbol of familiarity and peace despite being prisoners. So she hunts the silver serpent, which seems to be taking its power from the luminant moon. Lunar magic is mysteriously powerful and elusive. The moon and silver have many symbolic connotations, as well as the personified qualities of a pure virginal queen, untouched and shining like a mirror in the sky. The servant hops down into the canyon where there's a silver lake that flows into the ether and a golden fissure leading to the mother of trees, and then the stream sort of flows into a door in the sky, this passage to the afterlife. There's a green iron gate in front of the lake, which symbolizes a sort of magical imprisonment. The ghosts are here, and they're enduring. So long as the gate is closed, they remain trapped therein, despite there being no other visible barriers. There's an archway in the stones to the right leading towards the moon, denoting yet another passage into the nether. There's will-o-wisps flying around the canyon, and these wisps are often associated with misdirection and elusiveness. The curved retaining wall symbolizes the crescent shape of the goddess, which is containing the silver lake and preserving this cherry blossom tree despite the fact that its roots are growing under the wall towards the silver lake. There's also an archway with the goddess symbol that we saw on the Temple of Stella Quera here, hinting at pagan nature, religion, and spirituality. Cherry blossom trees are associated with birth and death, both beauty and violence and the female mystique. They're also a central motif in Japanese culture, as the brief blooming season is related to the brief but intense life of a samurai. And her battle, her little showdown that's about to happen with Lucia here is very much like a samurai duel. Traditionally, these trees bloom for only a few short weeks in the spring, so they're very precious and very timely. The silver swan is unsettling in its grace. Its form that Lucia chooses to take on, it's very beautiful and deceitful, trying to lure her into this state of complacency. And if not for the phantoms of the animals that are catching her eye in the background in the woods, she might have been hypnotized into submission before the battle ever began. A double eclipse is about to happen. The sun, the moon, and then this dark, shadowy planetoid are coming into alignment. The canyon is like an arena for the coming battle. Lucia rises out of the silver lake, riding on the bull, who was brought to life from its dormant statue by way of Penumbra being sacrificed at its altar. Lucia is dressed like Poet now. Her arrows are also alive, but in her case they are enslaved fairies. Her bow is a gnarled branch from the chokecherry tree that tried to ensnare her, a symbol of fear and potential danger, hence the purple once again. Poet does manage to bring the bull down with the power of her magic arrows, striking the beast right between the eyes, just like, David slaying Goliath. And we do notice a red star-shaped scar on the bull's forehead when the bull returns after this. The retaining wall is broken, which is the first indication that whatever is holding these unfortunate souls here can be undone, but not without consequences, not without making herself vulnerable. They have an archer's battle, and it's a stalemate. Neither of them can land a single shot. So they decide to duel with their swords instead. Poet pulls out Pusaka, and Lukiat has the scissor swords that Poet inadvertently bestowed upon her dark avian form whenever she threw them into her wing. Poet's attire begins to change as the double eclipse during the autumnal equinox commences. Her ferocity is reflected in the overlapping scales she wears, and they appear to catch fire as her whole outfit starts to transform. We see Lukiat retreat, but not of her own accord. It's almost as though she's compelled away in order to survive, much like how Poet does not want to run away from her shadow when Lukiat comes into power around the time of the solstices. It's a survival instinct. The double eclipse appears like a giant watchful eye, observing the battle as it travels through the canyon. Lukiat attempts to lure Poet into a confined space in order to trap her in a web, whereby Lukiat changes into this amalgam of scary forms, becoming this arachnid-type monster. But Poet's not intimidated. Her outfit completely changes now as the eclipse hits its peak, and it becomes full-blown armor. So she's empowered now. She can take down the monster with relative ease. She cuts away its supportive web and sends Lukiat into the silver stream. But that's not good enough. Lukiat will be back. Then she discovers the seahorse. It's all wrapped up in a web cocoon, who was blessed by the Mother of Trees to become her magical instrument, her cornet. And she missed out on meeting the seahorse back in the Dream Sea. Clearly, Lukiat deems him important enough to try and prevent them from ever meeting. The seahorse reminds her how quickly things can change around here, and even mentions how inconsistent the dream is, which was my own silly, self-deprecating way of pointing out my own lack of consistency in terms of how I draw each character and object throughout the story. I defend myself through her words, despite the fact that it sounds like an excuse, but it's just the truth of the matter. It was about making it fun and whimsical for me and not trying to contrive things so hard. So yeah, I had to put that in, poke fun at myself. So she plays the seahorse cornet and returns to the canyon to resurrect all these phantoms that Lukiat had trapped there. The green gate opens and the animals start heading back to their dream lives, but the coyote remains in the silver stream while the rest go back, including the Sunbear with the arrow still stuck in his haunch. The trees to either side of the gate that appeared dead before are suddenly blooming with cherry blossoms. The seahorse has shrunken down to a reasonably portable size, and the Geckomelion, who we now know is called Hellbender, brings her a dream star as a token of appreciation for saving all of you. We know he was searching for her and came with other motives, but now they're headed to get into some monkey business in Chapter 6. So just as a recap, she did battle, she listened to the words of Lukiat, has yet to decide if they ring true or not. She's victorious for now. She saved the souls of so many creatures, at least partially rectifying in her mind the carnage she left on the shores of the Southern Triangle, and she's made new, augmented with new armor, has this lovely new living instrument to play as she carries on towards whatever comes next. Of course, it is a bit suspicious that they're going to this fabled city. Speartooth's real happy about it, but we know that the suggestion was secretly planted in Penumbra's brain by Hellbender, so surprise, surprise, she's diving headfirst into the unknown yet again. Chapter 6 is Narcissus. Her purifying song is what happens at the climax of this chapter, so we spend the chapter kind of waiting to find out how that song will come into play. We start off testing Poet's control over the dream, alluding to her power as the dreamer. Though her desires are not manifested simply by wishing it, the desperate need for something warrants its summoning, and awareness seems to dictate how lucid she is in terms of being conscious of her place in the dream. Penumbra becomes a flying fox, like this big orange bat, and the fact that she's a bat-eared fox hints that she was always sort of destined for this transformation. They arrive at Uhai, and Penumbra can't recall how she knew about this place or its whereabouts. We now know, of course, that Hellbender planted these notions in the fox's mind, and the city of Uhai is this floating clockwork marble, time being this repeating theme once again. Courage, power, and wisdom, as well as freedom, are symbolized by the golden eagle that's on the city doors, and the spoon-billed heron is a regal amalgam of two distinct birds, much like the geckamelion is a mashup of two different reptiles. Again, dreams get weird, so we make up weird things to fill them. The clock reads 6 o'clock for the 6th chapter, the hour of Gidek, who is coming soon. Inside of the city, the clock reads 1 minute later to show that things are still progressing despite being sort of frozen in time here. The monkeys are under a golden spell cast by Lukiot, whose Blackbird and Two-Eyed Storm were seen outside looming around. The tapestries are predictive of the future and reflective of the past. All of the pipes, valves, and gears indicate a tinkering tendency and proficiency among the primates, suggesting that they are evolved and in pursuit of scientific truth. But we also get the sense that their loyalties are tenuous at best, and that they're easily swayed by their emotions. When she approaches the throne that was built for her because of prophecies that either existed to plant the suggestion in her mind to make them come true, or were true all along, and it was just only a matter of time until fate saw fit to make them happen, she sees a familiar musical symbol above the royal chair, this little circle there, and she's instantly inspired to play, using her seahorse cornet. This symbol is an abstracted representation of the fortissimo chord from Haydn's Surprise Symphony, which was supposed to wake everyone up who was falling asleep while listening to the music. It serves that precise purpose here. We also see a crown for her here, making her their queen. Now there's a few little tongue-in-cheek side notes here. The city is called Uhai, because when you are up there, you are way up in the sky, so Uhai. Also, they call her Yahoo, which sounds like Yahoo whenever they're screaming her name. But it actually does have a meaning. It's the Sumerian name for Eurydice, the nymph wife of Orpheus, the Greek prophetic musician, who tried to resurrect her after she died from being bitten by a snake with his enchanting music. So the name Yahoo also translates to the words exalted dove. They do refer to her as the Exalted One, and her name is related to the powers of creation and judgment. So all of these notions relate to her being a symbolic queen to them, bringing them the music to break the spell cast upon them, and also their aversion to reptiles and their reaction upon seeing the two-headed serpent Speartooth, who she hid behind the throne for a moment, all kind of line up with her name being Iyahu. So the monkeys throw a party once they wake up. We see banners that have the Zorn font on them, which is meant to show that their two civilizations are inextricably tied together, their fates dependent upon one another. And once again, Penumbra is deemed to be of lesser importance as the monkeys try to eat her. But Poet stops that from happening. She's got this whopper of a headache, and it comes from Hellbender trying to meddle with her thoughts. So the copper crown with the turquoise dream star is placed on her head, and phantasmal antlers sprout, suggesting that her headache might also be from these horns trying to grow from her temples. The monkey civilization is pretty insane. There's so much noise, it's very fast-paced. Each of them has some kind of issue that they're dealing with. They're all extreme personalities, and every one of them seems to be working an angle. The whole place is this compulsive mess of idiosyncratic chaos, which is meant to be a little bit of a commentary on our frenetic and demented world. So, the party is over once they realize Poet's brought a reptile into their midst. So they drag her away after a lengthy chase and fight, wherein Penumbra escapes to fight another day, flying off toward this wintry world that we will see later on in Chapter 8, which is symbolized by the falling snow, that little snowflake. So then the monkeys toss her and Speartooth into a jail cell, complete with a surprisingly human skull, magenta blood, perhaps from a Zorn aggregate, and there's a drawing of the Silver Servant on the wall. This is when we meet Tumbles, a little blue gnome who hates robots and clowns, but is dressed in a clown outfit to amuse his captors. And he knows Speartooth and reveals some of their backstory, as well as some inside info about the facets, which means little faces, of Uhai. She hears about Zorn and Gidek and this complicated relationship between these two conflicting civilizations. And it's then that Hellbender delivers the green key to her secretly, proving his usefulness, perhaps loyalty as well. And this key is something special, but for now it's just a means to an end. Tumbles leads her to the armory, where she retrieves her things, and the invisible Hellbender goes rummaging about in the Zorn scroll therein, reading whatever information the chimps may have stumbled upon or stolen. And this is when Tumbles reclaims his magic hammer and smashes the armory walls down, then starts rampaging through the city, whacking monkeys every which way. She uses this distraction to try to escape from the monkeys flying around on their skiffs. Yes, haha, they're flying monkeys, I know. I did that on purpose. Tongue-in-cheek, once again. Bad sense of humor, I know. It's like a dad joke. And she feels terrible for the monkeys despite the way that they treated her, that Tumbles is just taking them out. And that's when Geedak arrives. Geedak's this lion with wings and cyborg enhancements. He's pretty ridiculous, really. He's like some type of griffin amalgam from a distant realm, and the prophecy about her, it just doesn't suit her. She doesn't want to fight or be part of a war, so she tries to appeal to Geedak and to stop the conflict. But he's not buying it, and he demands that they fight. So Tumbles steps in her place, and because these two have fought before, they have a little bit of a score to settle. She's seen enough, and she uses the seahorse to blast everyone into submission. And it works, but it also rips open the floor, and this portal into another place outside of time opens, into which she falls. Now, right before all of this, the mouse showed up on the borders and leapt into the story to join her, because you could sense that the gazing chamber was being summoned. And that's where she's fallen to, this enigmatic space that's going to provide some time to reflect and consider what's happened so far and what is yet to come. Hence why it is the exact middle chapter of the book. So that's the recap of the Autumn Shard. I hope that filled in some of the gaps there for you, and we'll move on to the Winter Shard next. So we begin the Winter Shard, and recognize that winter, a season of hibernation and introspection, is cold and bleak, but not without a certain fragile beauty. Carnation is the exact middle chapter of the book, just like the gazing chamber is the room in the middle of everything. It represents the space that connects everyone's consciousness from birth and until death. The space was designed to feel like an ancient temple haunted with the echoes of cautionary tales and tests of agility, fortitude, and wisdom. The mouse, Zeke, this pint-sized guardian of the gazing chamber, accompanies her through the symbol-laden passageways, all the while explaining to Poet that the nature of the chamber is that it changes to accommodate any soul who finds its way into the sacred space. And since Zeke's special ability is being able to leap in and out of the narrative at will, being the guide through this way station that terminates in this dimensional gateway that can pretty much take you anywhere makes the most sense. The rainbow geyser that turned into this DNA chain that she followed down into the seeing room was symbolic of the fact that the gazing chamber is the origin of human consciousness exclusively, and the broken clock that's buried in this treasure pile is a symbol for time and toil. Time is the most precious thing. And we know this is actually a functional clock, despite the fact that it appears broken. It only appears broken right now because in chapter 12, after Uhai has fallen and she re-enters the gazing chamber, the clock activates and opens this portal that she actually needs to return home. So the apes did succeed in their pursuit of mastering the secrets of time, but it would not have been possible with just their ingenuity. Their science had to be paired with the magical spells that were cast upon it by the Zorn in order to make the clock of eternity. So these two disparate groups had to work together. Without them even realizing it, they did succeed. Her presence in the gazing chamber results in her imagination being unleashed in the form of a cathedral-type library that she enters, and her symbol can be seen on the domed roof of her special space. And she pulls a tome from the shelf and finds it to be her story, one that she's been working on all of her life, though it includes information about things that happened long before she ever entered this dream, such as the rise of Lukia, the summoning of the brazen bull, the great flood of tears that drowned the world. I mean, she was there, just not in this form, a different consciousness, a different identity. And it also contains tales of the facets of Uhai and this mythic civilization of Zorn we have yet to visit, as though in that moment her imagination is feeding her ideas resulting from her most recent experiences. There's a statue also of the silver servant beside her leather chair. It's an omen that just, keeps popping up, announcing itself and foreshadowing actually the next chapter. So she gets lost in the pages, veering away from her singular perspective to read about Geedak and Tumbles and the Zorn and how they enslaved the apes of Uhai and the clock that they were building, and Geedak arriving in this green egg that's very similar to the Zorn eggs, but much larger. Green eggs symbolizing growth and progress, but also the capacity for destruction. The mouse interprets these visions that come from her reading as a choice that she's giving to herself to either remain on track, seeking her name that will give her the power of her true identity, or to sidestep from the path and sort of veer away and take part in this ages-old conflict between these two societies, these reptiles and primates. The facets of Uhai and the aggregates of Zorn are meant to represent the division in society, both in their skills and their interests, but also beliefs and methods for accomplishing tasks and gaining power. The golden monkeys are the tinkerers, the craftsmen. They build their lives around these notions of freedom and individualism, whereas the Zorn are much more rigid and draconian in their methods, believing in their magic that they acquired through alchemy and sorcery. And though these things can be considered methods of scientific exploration, the philosophies are not the same, and the Zorn enslave the chimps to use their methods of science in concert with their magic, because really asking politely is just not in their nature. It's not really an option for them. Their society is organized in such a way that everyone is essentially a slave to progress, so why should it be any different for their captives? This opposition of belief in cruel treatment through subjugation and exploitation leads to the conflict between these two great societies. And that's a, sort of a hint at some things that have happened in our history. The prophecies are written by this unknown hand. They also help to stoke the fires of aggression as a form of propaganda, and it worked quite well to convince these two civilizations to hate each other, thereby planting the seed of war that would resonate for generations. It's the very reading of this section of the tome and entertaining the thought that solidifies its importance in her story. So there's no going back now. The prophecy will commence now that she is aware of its implications. And while she was in Uhai, the monkeys there and the subsequent events with Tumbles and Gidak were enough to suggest to her that there is some prophecy that includes her. And now that she's had time to reflect and space to think, and the gazing chamber has interpreted those suggestions into a narrative that is as true as she chooses to believe it is, things are going to move forward. And that was Hellbender's hope all along, which is why he's been there sort of manipulating things, hoping that they would work out this way. This is what he was hoping for. So then her visions wiped clear of all this imaginary symbolic history to show her this vision of her grandmother wearing a fruit pendant. She has flowing platinum hair and ghostly antlers like the ones that were protruding from her crown earlier to suggest the connection to the silver cervid, and the twin children are there, both green, different shades, and they're conjoined, just like Speartooth was, but not in the same manner, by something insubstantial, the silver cord, symbolizing both an umbilical link, but also the silver cord of the spirit connecting each soul to the ether and binding it to a physical body. So it's much like being tied at the tail. Or to assume that this is actually a deadly thing, that if you were to cut their tails, it would kill them. As referenced by Speartooth, it seems easy enough to separate them, but the result is still death. And the five-pointed bloody star shape in between these two infants indicates the wound of separation by the green scissors, normally distorted barber shears, but now taking on the form of those umbilical clamps I hinted at earlier. We see the symbols for the solstice and the equinox here, relating to the times when each of them gains the seed of power as well. So after these visions, she listens intently to Speartooth's origins, about their conjoined birth and adolescence, and about the evil Emperor Frith Marak. There are several references to social injustices here, from forced toil to predetermined roles to violence enacted in order to sustain obedience through the threat of punishment and fear of the Emperor's power. We learn the superstitious nature of the Zorn has led them to take extreme measures, and in the case of Solstice and Equinox, the Zorn names for Speartooth, they were cursed once they were deemed traitors to the cause. But up until that time they were hidden away because they were considered omens, being born with green skin. And tinkerers, like the scientific heretics of Uhai, being born different with a different thought process, with different skills, and of course the deformation of their being tied at the tail that often results in death. This was the perfect excuse for Frith Marak to just manipulate them into doing his bidding and acting like he was being merciful by hiding them away and letting them live and work in secret. But he was keeping them in this sort of prison of shame. So it's all symbolic of the way that people in power can manipulate others and use their dogmatic ideas to warp their minds, which eventually leads to suffering. So of course, we later learn that what Speartooth's slender half is sharing is an incomplete story, and that Hellbender was just involved and important a part of that tale as Tumbles and Gidak were, designing of the helmets to block out the Zorn mind control, which is a commentary on how certain belief systems and propaganda can control the way somebody thinks through fear, to the building of their methods of escape, these sky skiffs that they fly around on, gladiators, Gidak and Tumbles fighting, which leads to this uprising, and then they abscond to Uhai afterward, this clockwork city with connections to the Eastern Diamond constellation, which is why the city is diamond-shaped. And the forebearers of Gidak and the Ascendant, all these different connections that are sort of purposefully not given a lot of details so that you can allow your imagination to run wild with those things, because they're fringe parts of the story. They're part of the overarching story. They definitely are part of the climax of the story, but they're little imaginings that belong to her, and so they aren't completely fleshed out for us. So she learns about Tumbles and Speartooth's fate as a result of this grudge harbored after their escape from Zorn by the Aggregates and Gedak. The hatred between these two civilizations festered for many years, and nothing good would come of it. So it may fall upon her shoulders to rectify all of this and to bring a definitive ending to the years of suffering. It's something she feels she might truly have the power to change through her choices, and that's enticing considering the unpredictable and out-of-control nature of this dream thus far. So Zeke returns from somewhere in the chamber and leads Poet to an endless banquet table full of food. And this is a space of reflection and replenishment, so there needed to be some form of sustenance herein. Besides, some of my favorite fantasy stories have scenes that focus on food, and they always made me feel cozy, so it needed to be here to symbolize that sense of deep comfort that stories represent. The chair at the head of the table has her symbol on it as well, so clearly this version of the gazing chamber has been tailored to suit her in every regard, inviting her to stay and to be at peace. The apple that she chooses from the table is like the forbidden fruit, but in this case it just gives her a sense of contentment and perhaps a deeper knowledge of herself and what she most desires. The regenerative spring is like a stasis, like returning to the womb, a place of safety and comfort. The seahorse gets huge upon entering this spring because the water is just so powerful and regenerative. She wants to stay and be happy and avoid the stresses and trials of a difficult life. Something about this place makes us shed all of our concerns and false notions. There are no expectations anymore, just peace and rest. And so she looks at her reflection again. She stands up and she looks into the water. She sees Lukiat's face, but it doesn't summon her into the sacred space. However, the sight of her shadow face angers her greatly. She doesn't like that her identity feels contrived or that it carries this weight of certain expectations with it. Her chat with Speartooth seems to have kind of carried over into her retrospective moment here. This notion of being categorized and pushed into a specific direction based on the perceptions of others causes her to reject the concept of existing in such a rigidly obtuse and close-minded society. So she sort of telepathically cuts her long hair as a symbol of taking back control and going against nature in order to grow stronger from the root on her own. Her pallor becomes pale, she turns more androgynous so as not to allow that form of classification to determine for her who she should be and what she should do. The name she seems contradictory at this point, but the label doesn't bother her. It's only as harmful as she allows it to be, and the word itself is not as concerning as the way she perceives herself, so she kind of ignores that for now, and it will become more important to her later on. This entire conundrum of existence that she's dealing with is both indicative of the philosophy that I carry about the way we use certain classification to dismiss and demean and belittle others, into submitting to our preconceived notions about how things should be. And it's also a hint about how being at the confluence of every consciousness sort of changes an open mind to accept and absorb a varied approach to existence. She's encountering the entire spectrum of self-identification through the reflective mirror of the universe. She's also wearing thin the veil that hides from her the truth about who and what she is, an aspect of me, who identifies as male, and who purposefully chose to make Poet female. I chose this for her, and in a way she's sort of rejecting that notion on general principle. And this may be the first step towards both realizing that she is imaginary, and in me recognizing that despite having created her, she actually exists beyond me, and that I oppress her freedom simply by existing. She's controlling her own path now, and yet I'm writing it, so again, there's some friction there. She wants to be a self-determining entity, but she cannot escape from the shadow of me, her creator. The echo of a song is resounding through the gazing chamber. It's a song of surrender and peace. It resonates as it has been here for ages and belongs to another figure from outside the dream. And as humans, we instinctually seek connections in order to expand our understanding of the meaning of what seems to be meaningless, this existence, to bring purpose to our feelings of purposelessness. This song was designed to heal and to mend wounds. It's what she needs right now, because being in this space, she is subconsciously realizing that something is missing from her being, that there is a gap in her consciousness that needs to be healed. And that's why she's appearing pale and ghostly, almost transparent. She's not a complete individual, because as we now know, and as she will soon find out, she isn't real. She is fictoplasm, essentially. She's an idea brought to life through the writing. So she follows this song through the chamber, and its sound does make her feel more whole, more complete, though it's just soothing away the pain of not knowing. It's not really repairing the emptiness. The poet and Zeke, they go walking, and eventually they walk into a booby trap, which is a battering ram, hence the ram skull, with a 5-pointed star symbol that's on there mimicking the birth wound she now perceives as being an omen, which Lukiat mentioned in Chapter 5, and the vision of the twin children being separated in her book displayed this same symbol, though it has not yet manifested upon her, which hints that it's coming, and that though she can run from it, she probably can't hide from it. Zeke is a trap setter, but he's not a trap detector. I mentioned that. He didn't see this coming, and that'll play a role again in Chapter 10. He tells her how the chamber has changed and become quite dangerous since she entered, which may be the chamber's way of rejecting her, since she's not a complete consciousness. Perhaps there's a built-in system that disposes of incomplete souls that have no business setting foot in this sacred space. She pursues the echo of the healing song through this treacherous area, leaping and swinging after using an arrow to set loose a vine from the cavern ceiling, to avoid falling into the silver stream that's rushing between the pillars of the subterranean space. And that ominous silver servant is there again, always watching over her, but perhaps more portentous now than ever before. It becomes apparent at this point that Hellbender is still with her, but remains invisible. She finds this glowing doorway, and of course she's been carrying this green key since escaping from Uhai, and so perhaps that's why suddenly we're seeing Hellbender again, because he gave her the key, so enabling her to open this room. This was part of that prophecy, perhaps, that we will never read, but that Hellbender knows all about, and is trying to make things happen. She uses it here to open this weird door, and it sets free a symbolic decoration, bringing to life the cricket and setting the paradox in motion. For if this is indeed the cricket's place of origin, which we could assume, then somehow it's she who manifested it through her very presence here. But if this is not of her design, then how did it come to be here? These are questions we could address again down the road, but they're sort of meant to be a mystery. So she steps into the orbiculus ocularum, the eye of the universe. And there's fire racing across the floor, but it's not burning anything. It's showing that it's spiritual in nature, and it produces light and heat without destroying the inner sanctum. We also see the statue resembling this Hindu god Ganesha. The Hindu religion has no single founder, and is widely accepted as being the oldest religion, and hence the core of this space, the room wherein one may traverse the entirety of existence in a blink, is overseen by a version of Ganesha, a god associated with paving the way forward, overcoming obstacles. And if you recall, in the first chapter, that spiral elephant trunk air freshener referenced the removal of an obstacle. In that case, the obstacle of Poet's forebearer, who by dying released her into being, got out of the way and made room for her. Elephants create paths just by walking through the jungle, so these paths are ready to be traveled. All the traveler need do is imagine where they want to go. The two tusks of the elephant denote wisdom and emotion, and the cracked tusk of emotion reminds us that we must overcome our emotional responses in order to master ourselves and our choices. Mouses and elephants also have this sort of deeply knotted history symbolically in fables, and I could spend a long time unpacking that, but I'll leave that to you if you choose to dive deeper. I'm sure you've seen cartoons where a mouse runs out and the elephant screeches and runs away like this huge animal is afraid of this tiny little mouse. But there's more to it than that. The mouse is a wandering spirit, and Ganesha in this case is just here, a statue content in its position as the universe is within, so traveling means just going inward. So the two of these symbols coming together, one so large and another so small, they're just diametrically opposed. They create this tension for this climactic scene of Chapter 7. The basin that the statue is holding symbolizes the need to see one's reflection and know oneself before choosing one's new path. It also relates to memory, reflection, looking back, and coming to terms with the past in order to move forward. This being the space right smack dab in the middle of everything makes it the perfect spot to consider all that has happened thus far and what it means for her trajectory. So she summons Pusaka, Then she decides to destroy the basin, rejecting where she has come from and who she's been out of regret for not knowing better all along. All these feelings of anger and resentment that have sort of built up since she's been in the gazing chamber and thinking about everything. That's when the silver dancer is unleashed upon her. You can hear the rhyme about the number 2, that the number 2 can never be. These prevailing enigmas are becoming very frustrating to her, and she feels. But the power of the blade cannot defeat this silver sprite. It's showing that you can't undo the past, at least not through violence. You can't destroy a memory, nor should you try, as it has informed your present self. And the cricket's chirping the whole time, trying to tell her that she needs to use music. Use the song to heal the basin, which the mouse does echo that sentiment after the battle's been going on for a while. It's the only way to mend what you've done. You can't undo it. You can only repair it through a new course of action. So in a moment of realization, she pulls out the seahorse and plays the song that she's been hearing, and it ends up healing the basin and returns her mood and overall outlook to a more optimistic and hopeful one, despite feeling somewhat lost now and uncertain about what's around the corner. The cricket becomes part of Pusaka for now, jumps up onto the hill, but it disappears, and it'll remain there, stowing away into the next dimension, which will also help to create this paradox. So the mouse leaves her, telling her just to keep moving forward in order to find the answers that she seeks, and he promises to rally her friends in the dream to come help her, while Poet decides to go in search of Penumbra, faced with the choices of seeking her name or fulfilling a warrior's destiny to lead the army of Uhai, which she read about in her book. Instead, she chooses to seek her friend, because that is who she is, and that choice is more indicative of her personality than either of the other two options. So upon entering her chosen portal, she sees her monogram, which she's not familiar with it yet. She doesn't know what it is. She thinks, P.S. postscript, what is that? She puts her crown on, and the antlers emerge again, and she feels and hears the Geckomelion on her shoulder, who tells her that he's been lost and searching for her, and along with his presence comes this uneasy feeling, something intuitive. Perhaps an instinct arising in her that is a result of her sudden transformation. On to Chapter 8. Violet. She leaps through the portal and emerges on the other side in the form of a reindeer, making the connection to the Silver Servant, who's this older version of the Great Deer Mother that she has now become. And yes, as I mentioned in the little opening introduction to that particular video, female reindeer do have antlers. So this is essentially her spirit animal. Much like so many others exist in the dream as animal versions of themselves, this would be hers, despite what we know, that she's merely a dream and has no human counterpart on the other side. This being the first indication that perhaps she's not of that world, and since she's expressly human in this one and only becomes a deer randomly, like just now, she is immediately pursued by Lukiat in the form of a flock of blackbirds that transforms into wolves. And this is the time of the winter solstice, so Lukiat's becoming more powerful. So this chapter mimics Chapter 2 in a way, but the seats of power are reversed. The windmill could be related to the lighthouse, being similar in shape, but this one with frozen sails out of which the finch flies. At this point, though we don't realize it, the paradox is occurring, for within the finch, who last ate during warmer weather, he's got a cricket in his stomach. And we know this because in Chapter 12, that cricket is cut from his belly and sent back in time for the Stargazer to chase. Then it ends up on the southern triangle, hides in his lighthouse, and we can assume from that illustration in Chapter 4, as well as one of the stained glass illustrations from Chapter 13, that the finch eats the cricket sometime after Poet goes through the ceiling to meet the Ascendant. So in this moment, there is a cricket inside the finch, and there is one attached to the hilt of Pusaka, which is inside of her imagination. These two crickets never actually see one another or interact necessarily, but they do exist in the same temporal space for a time until the end of Chapter 9, when the finch drinks the Nixerva and goes back in time. Anyhow, back to Chapter 8. So how the finch came to be here is unspoken. His broken wing kept him from migrating with his family, so he was left behind, which is a theme repeated in him going backwards in time in Chapter 9. But the lighthouse and the windmill being so similar hints that this space is like a derivation of the Southern Triangle, and windmills are often associated with Don Quixote, becoming illusory giants. This hints at how this particular chapter is a bridge between major events. And also, beginning with Ganesha in the previous chapter, there are characters from beyond this dream that are making their way into the dream, culminating in the story of Marcius, who's clearly imaginary. So we're seeing those influences that were mentioned in Chapter 4, that we saw hints of in Chapter 2 on her bookshelf. All these little things are starting to come into play now. Penumbra does show up to save her from the wolf pack since her deer form is not a match for them, and Penumbra is wounded. Poet transforms back into her human form with new attire, suggesting that her deer form was sort of a filter and a temporary guise while her new outfit prepared itself. How and why she takes on this form remains a mystery. It happens almost reflexively, unbeknownst to her, and outside of her control. And the repeated presence of the silver servant in the background of previous chapters reinforces that sense of mystery. Deer tend to symbolize an instinct, things that others don't notice the deer is aware of. And that's perhaps because she is closely related to my subconscious, being my imagination manifest. Poet uses her arrows to send the wolves downstream and melt the ice, similar to the way she sent the grotesque amalgam of Lukiat's arachnid form into the silver stream, once with Pusaka, this time with the arrows of the laughing tree. We do see some frozen violets in the shape of that seed symbol on an embankment here. This is the last chapter with the seed symbol distinction. Chapter 9 will change over to the fruit, which is the symbol of the crone. Hellbender's backstory and involvement in their quest is made clear now by the fatter head of Speartooth, completing the story that the thinner head started telling in Chapter 7. Their exchanges and the fluctuations of their paired demeanors show that, despite having distinctly different personalities, they do share certain traits. Hellbender's motivations seem beneficent, but it's hard to be sure and difficult to trust someone so sneaky, though Speartooth claims we can trust him, so I guess we'll just have to. The ice castle that wounded Penumbra leads Poet to has this rainbow ward guarding it from intruders, like light through a prism. It blinds eyes like an enchantment unless you're invited to be there, which Penumbra is. And Penumbra's bleeding out, struggling to breathe, and having essentially sacrificed herself to save Poet, we can perhaps now see that upon assuming her animal form, that her steed may no longer be required. The tapestries within the ice castle show stories from outside the dream, again coming back to those references very heavily in this particular chapter for a reason, and Marcius's music aches with the beauty of mortality. He's not from this dream. He exists beyond it as a character in another narrative from long ago. He introduces himself after attending to Penumbra. He says he knows Poet's story, as do all who exist in this dream, because it belongs to her. Thus her tale is upon the very air itself. So Marcius tells his story, which is a tragedy, and it mirrors her own in a way, being powerless to avoid a task forced upon him by this godlike power, and when choosing to defy that power, he's tortured and killed, only to be resurrected and then enduring further punishment for past misdeeds. All of these things happen to her in a markedly different way, and perhaps that's why she decides to rain on his parade and tell him that his song is tainted by his terrible deeds, and that the love he feels for Errata, the muse of love, actually Erato, but I changed it to Errata for the purposes of making it my own version of it, it's unrequited, and that he was fooled so that she could survive and revive her murdered sisters, and this crushes Marcius's heart, the one thing that survived his torturous death to resurrect him. So her words had power, and she heard him, and I think she ends up regretting that. His past involvement in the Rogues Gallery interactions with Hellbender and Tumbles aside, he's clearly a thoughtful and decent being who has given up his criminal past to try and rectify what he's done through healing, echoing what occurred to her in the gazing chamber with the Silver Dancer, or the destruction that she caused on the beach that she wants to make good for. She can empathize, but she feels she's got to find her own song. She can't save Penumbra, despite believing that she's in control of the dream. And that's when the outside influence, Marcius, realizes that she must not be real. Else she'd have been able to save Penumbra, unless she actually subconsciously did not want to, which doesn't seem likely. Penumbra's death before the tapestry of the bull, and the tears that Poet sheds summon the bull back from death, still sporting a star-shaped scar on its forehead from where her arrow landed in Chapter 5. The finch has been manipulated by Hellbender, so he's kind of out of it until the bull snorts and scorches his tail. Henceforth his tail is an ever-burning flame, as though something magical causes the flame to endure, whether it be the power of Lukiat's bull, or maybe the cricket that's in its belly. So Marcius drops his syrinx, pulls out a red rapier, mimicking the crimson branch of Pusaka, and he calls his steed, the Pegasus unicorn from the tapestry to the left of the fireplace, into being, and they do battle with the bull and its armored Rider, which is just another distorted manifestation of Lukiat's power, which keeps transforming because the winter solstice is approaching. She flees as Marsyas instructs, despite not wanting to retreat from her enemy. She goes behind the tapestry that foreshadows her death with the tidal wave that will consume her. She passes by all manner of dead creatures in the catacombs, as there is much death in this chapter, and more to come, being foreshadowed. She finds the Pisces, her boat, according to Marsyas it's hers, and the Finch is waiting for her there. So they hop in and they make their escape while the castle shakes to its foundations. The Pisces is purple, again, as it takes her away from one type of danger but conveys her towards another, and it will change color eventually. The glacial grave, where there is one who forgot to die, at least that's what she's been told, very mysterious, and she's going there to meet them. And as she goes, she can see the rainbow ward that's protecting this ice castle crumbling, because Penumbra's death and her tears gave Lukiat's power a window to bypass this protective barrier. And inside the castle, Hellbender has transformed into his fully upright bipedal Zorn warrior form. He becomes visible, he takes some power from the fireplace, leaps out, he's ready to go. He's got his flaming dagger, and he and Marsyas, which, they're old frenemies, are reunited to do battle with this scourge, who ends up destroying them both. So Hellbender saw to it that part of the Zorn prophecies were fulfilled. That's what he was doing when he was shuffling about in the Uhai armory, looking through the scrolls while he was invisible, double-checking them maybe, to see that what he'd taught Tumbles to translate was correct and that he made sure the wording was as he remembered. We never get to read the actual prophecies, but we hear a lot about them and they fill in enough of the gaps that we don't need to. They're expected to play out a certain way and we're just kind of watching and waiting to see if they do. At this point, Hellbender feels he has performed his duty and he's ready to die an honorable death, fighting beside his old partner in crime. He tells Marsyas that despite all things being what they are, his love for Arata was returned and so he can die with some peace in his heart. And they do mention Tumbles and allude to the fact that he's the one of the three of them that's going to end up surviving and to tell their story. This is when Nyxerva comes into play for the first time. It's associated with ambrosia for the Greek gods or Amrit for the Hindu gods. It's a source of power and immortality. Drinking it will keep the gods immortal and young forever. Drinking during a grand occasion in memory of someone or something is why we drink to remember, but we also imbibe these deleterious liquids to soothe away the tragic nature of certain memories, forget about problems, so that's why we drink to forget. We drink to remember, we drink to forget. The Nyxerva is the ink with which we write the stories that extend the life of the imaginary. So there's this green cloud that hides within it Lukiat's sylph form, and Poet flees from that, trying to avoid her until her peak of power has passed, until the winter solstice is over. Marsyas planted the seed of doubt in her mind, though, that she may not be real. But it's also the kind of revelation that has little bearing on her actions. I mean, what can she really do about it? It may or may not be true. Whether or not it is, all she can do is keep moving forward. Chapter 9 is Daffodil, which is my favorite flower. It's my birth month, March. And this is when we switch from the symbol of the mother to the fruit of the crone. She is introduced to Nyxerva. There is a backup bottle that Marsyas stowed in the Pisces, and the Finch tells her all about it and its potential consequences if you drink it. The icy sea is inhospitable and bleak, but also kind of beautiful, as the dream stars are falling from the sky, symbolizing that Marsyas's revelation may be causing the facade of the dream to collapse because her perception is changing. She uses her seahorse to summon these orcas who come in to investigate them. They're a trinity who symbolize a family, and this mirrors the mother and her twins we later learn about in this chapter. But in this case, the parent is male with a large upright dorsal fin, very intimidating. She moves towards the auroras, and the orcas grant the vessel passage, helping the Pisces through the icy sea. The Greeks saw Aurora personified as a goddess who races across the sky to tell the sun and the moon that a new day is dawning, foreshadowing that one is going to sleep, the other is waking, and that there is a coming change. The moon is also changing from this icy blue to a blood red, symbolizing the 9th chapter, which aligns with the notion of 9 phases of the moon, which are also connected to feminine energy, and this is sort of Lukiat's peak of power, and of course it also foreshadows the blood that accompanies her coming death. So all of those things are connected. The double-page spread with her walking down the blue beach with all the embedded dream stars, shows this swoop of energy blowing past the finch, which we later find out is actually the finch flying backwards through time and zipping past itself as it goes. By the way, I refer to the finch as it. I wrote the finch as an it, despite being associated with a male friend of mine, because the finch has a certain distinction that goes beyond the caucus or the triumvirate or any of the other animals, really. Its role in the story is improbable and more timeless than the rest. It's a key part of the story, and therefore I felt like this was the best way to make that distinction. The finch is not an object, but it was the easiest way for me to do that. So she discovers her song and plays it to wake the dead, for this whole island is a cemetery, and everything about it's designed to be strange and unsettling, from the trees to the tombstones that litter the landscape, to the phantoms that roam the expanse, mumbling to themselves about the lives they have yet to leave behind. When she encounters the snow shadow, this fabled, horrific creature that she's been hearing about, she sees its red chain, the shackle of guilt holding it in place. The snow shadow is like a werewolf or a wendigo or some mythical, bloodthirsty beast of fables and nightmares. Its footprints don't match the size and shape of its actual feet, hinting that this is an illusory disguise that it's wearing. And there's a hole in the earth that it retreats into, leaving behind the precious flower that it's protecting, mimicking the way that Sophia tried to protect Poet from Lukiad in the dream but had to leave her behind. And she's about to reveal that. And Poet follows the beast into the empty well. There's also this mookish gravedigger we see in the background making a cameo here. That's a character I made up a while ago and would draw when I was in a bad mood. The mook represents me when I'm feeling bitter and grouchy, and just sort of roaming about digging graves and moping about his existence. So if I do another project sometime down the line here, it might be a webcomic involving the mook. Anyhow, back to the story. She plays a song that migrates into the well-shaped tunnel and attacks the snow shadow's monstrous form, revealing the golden lady beneath. The shape her song takes changes from dandelion tufts to silverfish and then into these like wispy pink ovular puddles of sound, like a spell that's dissolving a curse. Its power is in her creative approach. There's a lantern on the wall that contains her next dream star, of course, which she awakens by blowing on it, giving it her life's breath, so that it might illuminate the truth for her, which is what her supposed mother, or this golden lady, says she is about to do. Her mother is draped in a red blanket that resembles the one from the first chapter that Poet had on her lap. The silver-served symbol is there in the corner. Her monogram appears in the flames coming off of her in this illustration as well. And then Sophia tells her story about the chariot of death, which we saw as a semi-truck, but here it looks more like an actual chariot, drawn by a version of Lukiad, draped in this purple cloak with a fiery horse and an icy horse driving the chariot forward. And the Redbird is nearby overseeing this oncoming disaster, so it's like a reinterpretation of the moment that we saw. So maybe this is how it might have been seen from the perspective of someone who was within the dream and had already crossed the threshold. We see Sophia in her birthday suit entering the womb of the universe to be reborn into her own dream. We see her with her twin children in the image below that, and then her central depiction mimics that of that pagan threefold symbol of the goddess, a waxing crescent, a full moon, and a waning crescent. We see her caring for her two children when they are young, in the lower right. One's happy, playing in the golden light of the sun, and Sophia's smiling at her, while restraining the other child who is drawn towards the silver side of existence, hinting that without balance, that part of us that is unattended will eventually break free and, make some noise. We see Sophia leaving Poet behind in this sanctuary that she has built to separate and hide her in order to protect her from Lukiad. And then we see Lukiad use her bandana to make a shackle for her and transform her into this beast and use her as bait to lure Poet into her new web. In fact, this hole in the ground, this wishing well, which if you look at the mortar, it's the same color as the web of Lukiad in Chapter 5, to show that it is sort of a trap for her. Whether or not all these things Sophia has told her are necessarily true is up for debate, especially since she's still grappling with the idea that Marcius planted in her head about not even being real in the first place, so everything has become very complicated now. Maybe by sending her here, Marcius believed that Sophia's story would help her to decide for herself what she believes is really going on. As Poet helps Sophia stand, we see that the silver-served symbol from the blanket has done the same. We see all manner of spirits are paying attention to them now. At this point, she's asked to re-summon Pusaka, despite having sworn the weapon off for good out of fear of its destructive capacity. But Sophia does convince her that no music can free her from the crimson shackle, So she does choose to sunder it with Pusaka, and the sword then changes demeanor, growing little flowers from its thorns and becoming a tool of emancipation as opposed to a force of violence. It is, in this case, justified and righteous in a way, so the sword is transformed. Sophia's third eye, a symbol of enlightenment and vision that surpasses this dream, opens as she closes the others and she sees her clear destination. She becomes one with the awakening sun. We know that Lukiat is coming because Sophia spoke that forbidden name and sent out a beacon to bring about their fateful meeting. Sophia tells Poet that she should forgive her sister for what she's done. All the torment is a result of her own failed upbringing and past trauma, and she has to be understood, and then perhaps she'll relent and surrender. Lukiat's playing that lute from her bedroom. It's actually the scissors in another form. And Lukiat's face in this illustration resembles more the two-eyed storm to show that her power is at its peak and that her identity is bound to her being this destructive force of nature. Sophia is free, and she takes off to merge with the ether, developing the wings of a butterfly, which Poet will also acquire at the end of chapter 12. Sophia leaves Poet behind, and Poet tries to give chase, but Sophia is just too fast. Poet removes the dream star daffodil from the lantern. She pulls back her hood, exposing herself, becoming vulnerable at that point, revealing her regrowing hair. And she seems to have found some sense of peace after having spoken with Sophia, whether or not she's decided that she believes it, or if it's all an elaborate lie, and none of this is real anyway, because she's not real. She just doesn't really seem to be concerned. She's ready to go and meet her fate. So she returns to the Pisces, and despite the Finch's warning, she guzzles down almost the whole bottle of Nyxerva, because at this point, why not? A dose of fatal courage like what Marcius took before diving into battle and embracing his death, he might as well. So she goes to meet her twin shadow sister out on the sea, gliding across it like she's ice skating, and the remaining crew of the Pisces decide to follow her out and support her, knowing that she goes to meet her end. We see all manner of things going on in this image right before they meet, and if you look real close you can even see the future in this little pocket of fluid to the right side attached to the two-eyed storm. It's got the mouse, Sunbear, and Sloth in it, which is actually from the end of chapter 10. They emerge from the mountain of water into the cloud that is the two-eyed storm to observe the definitive battle between Poet and Lukiat before the storm breaks, and then they all fall into the ocean. This actually suggests that the oncoming tidal wave that happens after Lukiat dies is a result of the collapse of the mountain of water. There's yellow drops of rain. These are peaceful and loving as opposed to the dangerous purple drops of rain we saw in chapters 3 and 8 and actually at the start of this chapter. So, they meet. Lukiat gives her 2 scars, but Poet accepts it peacefully, going to her death, embracing Lukiat with love instead of the anger, fear, and sadness that have lured and fueled this dream demon all along. And this causes Lukiat to discorporate, becoming one with Poet, who has finally accepted this part of herself, rather than trying to fight it off or escape from it or hide from it, and hence they become one, and Poet just falls over right as the Pisces arrives to receive her. And with her eyes closed, the Pisces and her friends are consumed by this silver wave. However, the Finch does manage to escape after drinking that final drop of super concentrated leftover Nyxerva that she left behind. The power of that liquid working in concert, no doubt, with the cricket in his tummy and the flame on his tail sends the little yellow bird soaring backwards through time to set in motion events that have already happened before and have also not yet happened. So that is how the Winter Shard ends, and next we will enter the Spring Shard. So we begin with the standard preface read by the slithering voice, which seems to suppose that Poet is dead and the story is pointless to continue with at this point. And then we get the double-page spread of Lancet and Rose windows depicting hints of what's coming in this season, and we start with Chapter 10, Daisy. Departing from our story about Poet because she has died and shifting our gaze towards the other characters of the dream, the animals. The sloth is introduced, and his character is cantankerous and humorous and uninhibited. He finds the finch lying on the beach, having landed here and now, after escaping from the tidal wave that claimed Poet and the Pisces. Sloth sees this little feller as the perfect way to interrupt the caucus, so he scoops up the little yellow bird and does just that. The caucus is like the round table, and all of these animals represent friends on the other side, so these are the placeholders or versions of them that occupy my imagination. Each one takes the place of a supernumerary, but each one is more than simply an extra. The equivalent being the animals in fables take on this allegorical type of personality. These animals are a symbol for people. They aren't the actual people. They're my version of those people. So these are the placeholders that occupy my brain. So they're having their daily meeting within the roots of the laughing tree, and they all hold special seats that denote their importance to the dream, hence the trifecta of slightly more elaborate thrones for the triumvirate of bright creatures. We also see the phantom of the coyote sitting in a seat below this dagger that resembles the same implement of death that Marsyas had in his flashbacks of killing the muses. That's because it is yet another symbol from outside the dream. The dagger is like the sword of Damocles hanging by a thread, tempting fate and testing faith, hovering above the Siege Perilous, which was the seat reserved for the knight who would recover the Holy Grail. Anyone who sits in it and is unworthy of the Grail will die. Now, in this case, Coyote did die, but the caucus was not told the specifics of his death, and so the seat is kind of seen as being cursed. This is the first hint of Kestrel's deviousness. Having not discussed the arrival of Luciot and Poet, he remains mum on the subject, even after the Finch tells them what happened. The seat is now reserved for she who sleeps beyond the stars, who all of them sort of see as being this almost mythological character, who can undo the curse of Coyote's throne. None of them seems to remember being brought back from death by she, and none of them remember being saved by this she that the mouse told them about. Mouse has always been a little weird to them, and Sunbear too. For he was absent from the caucus for so long, they almost forgot about him. None of them knows or remembers he was cursed by the dark light. Their memories are hazy at best, as though they lack the lucidity that Sunbear, Mouse, and Kestrel have, being aware of their place in the dream. Mouse's claim just sounds like apocryphal nonsense to them, and they pass it off as though, despite claiming Poet as their deity, none of them really believes in her. Sunbear and Mouse are the only ones, so they do not participate in the caucus. It's a lot of that group mentality, sort of tribal, almost mob mentality that this group has when they're together. When Sloth bursts in and reveals the Finch, and after Finch wakes up and tells them about what has happened, the caucus explodes into argument about whether or not all of the legends about she who sleeps beyond the stars are true, and if this bird is just raving mad making up stories about this mythic being. But how would he know about her, and why does no one here know who this bird is? It's not a member of the caucus, so its presence suggests that there are more animals in the dream who the caucus are not acquainted with. It's all very jarring to their comfortable little world view. This upheaval will cause problems, because if it's true, it's potentially apocalyptic what's about to happen. Maybe the mouse was right. Sunbear sure seemed convinced, so we can now really start to see how shady the Kestrel or Stargazer is being, and since we now know that the triumvirate of bright creatures are all a part of him, we can probably deduce that this magical trinity used some type of mind-altering spell to keep most of the caucus ignorant and forgetful. The Stargazer's cloak bore the salamander symbol, suggesting a connection to Zorn. The Redbird also had this symbol on its back. In the flashback image of the Ascendant's students, there was that one with the same symbol looking like it might have been a younger version of Stargazer. The Cobra, being a reptile, may have Zorn connections. Though he is green, which they don't like, the Zorn see that as a bad omen. The Cobra is the monthly symbol for this chapter. Snake charmers use them, pull them into a trance, and they sort of follow the movement of the flute. So maybe that's what's being suggested here. Despite having nothing to say within the chapter, it could be the Cobra that's manipulating the minds of the caucus behind the scenes. Kestrels are associated with patience and shrewdness. Cobras symbolize quickness, protectiveness. They're a symbol of power as well as knowledge, wisdom, and decisiveness. So despite being the least verbal of the triumvirate, the true mystical abilities of the Cobra may be the glue that holds the three of them together. The Albatross, whose symbol we've seen once on the back of the semi-truck in Chapter 1, is very often seen as a bad luck omen. But it could also be good luck, depending upon the situation. They are navigators, they're wanderers, so taken together we see all of Stargazer's traits kind of exemplified through these three creatures. It's decided that the Sloth, Sunbear, and Mouse should go sail across the Dream Sea into the Two-Eyed Storm and investigate whatever might be happening, according to this Finch. Sloth is not happy about this, but the caucus probably look upon these social pariahs as the three most disposable among them, hence they're being volunteered to go on this suicide mission. Now, it can probably be assumed that the triumvirate planted the suggestion in order to get rid of these three, them being the ones who have foreknowledge of Poet, especially if they're trying to keep her a secret, so they're liabilities. So all of this may have played out in such a way as Kestrel sort of designed it. So we skip over to the beach, we see the mouse and the Sunbear together. Mouse has sewn shut the wound on Sunny's haunch, closing it over to heal, but leaving the arrow's tip inside to keep the curse of silver from returning to possess him. They discuss their concerns about how everyone forgot about Poet except for Zeke. Even Sunbear would have forgotten if Zeke hadn't let him read her story, which suggests he may have brought a little something back from the gazing chamber with him. Maybe he lifted one of the books off the shelf. Sunbear is suspicious of Kestrel, being reasonably sure that his memories should still be intact because he was never taken by the dark light. If in fact it is the trauma of death and resurrection that dissolved the caucus's memories of her in the first place, and not some type of mind control spell, as we might suspect. But either way, it means that the Kestrel's methods and whatever is going on, whatever he's doing, are questionable. We can see a spiral vortex on the horizon. It's purple and it's shrouded by dark clouds, very ominous. We also see those three pillars of steam that we saw in chapters 2 and 3, and when Sloth was meandering up the beach a little bit earlier. Kestrel lands on a dead tree nearby and assures the duo that he does in fact remember her and that their suspicions are correct. Though being a master of manipulation and courtesy, Kestrel convinces them that his subterfuge with the caucus was necessary to prevent a panic and to get things done, since the caucus tends to move very slowly in their deliberations, according to the wizardly bird. Sloth shows up, and Kestrel tells them that the three of them have been selected for this important mission, knowing that the mouse and Sunbear, both who know of she's sort of using this against them. For this was not an easy choice, this mission, and knowing that they would, out of loyalty and love, go and help her in any way they can, because they both have good moral centers, and he counted on to do what's right and to be brave in the face of certain doom. So he knew that he could count on them. Sloth might be reluctant, but in the end, if he returns from this mission, he knows it'll secure him a gloating position and grant him higher esteem among the caucus. Kestrel reminds them that there's a great treasure that legendarily resides within the storm, and perhaps this would be a good time to retrieve it if the storm is in fact dormant or distracted, which would give them the upper hand. This treasure is a fable to the caucus, much like Poet. They all acknowledge its existence, but are skeptical as to the actual truth of the tales about it. Like searching for the Holy Grail. It's a wonderful ideal to strive for, but we don't know if it's actually a real thing. So they make an old wash basin into their boat for traversing the Dream Sea, making them look like, three men in a tub from the old nursery rhyme. In this same wash tub can be seen one of the stained glass images of chapter 13, but it was Coyote who used it initially to come to the Southern Triangle. So that makes it that much more foreboding. The three mammals hop into the boat and set off to investigate the two-eyed storm that has been sitting dormant upon the horizon for some time. They barely fit in the boat, and Sloth and Sunbear are quite combative, arguing back and forth about their situation and driving the mouse a little bit crazy. As they sail off, we see the finch, whose wing has been rebroken and it's now set in a sling. And as he'd mentioned, he'd not been able to migrate because of this broken wing several seasons ago, so his family left him behind. Sitting beside Kestrel on a tree branch, as he is unfit to join the search party, you can see that the look on his face is kind of desperate and worried. The story we don't know, and that I kept to myself, is that after she shot into the sky through Stargazer's lighthouse, the finch happened upon the cricket outside of the lighthouse and ate it. And Stargazer saw this and was very angry about it. He probably whacked the bird, maybe broke his wing, before he managed to escape. So you can imagine that Kestrel was probably quite surprised about seeing this little bird again, having him right there on their table, but he maintained his composure and didn't say anything. He wasn't sure he'd ever find the cricket after the finch ate it, but somehow it has been delivered directly to him. The convenience and relative irony is concerning, but he never lets an opportunity slip away. So Kestrel took advantage of that, and after the three mammals leave and there's no one else around to interfere with his plans, Kestrel looks at the finch ominously and asks in a strangely changing voice that begins slithering as it rolls out of his beak if he can see what's inside of him. He knows that the cricket is still in there and he wants it back. So we can assume after this that he subdues the finch, takes him back to the triumvirate's table, so that when we see them again they have the finch, splayed out on the table with the porcupine quills ready for dissection in chapter 12. The trio of mammals make their way across the sea, and whenever Zeke raises his voice in anger, the two-eyed storm responds by tearing open and pulling back the veil, allowing them to enter her sacred space. We do see the same grid lines of green on black that we saw in the wishing well, in the glacial grave, and before that it was on her green spider web. Both are similar symbols and they both suggest a trap, so the same could be assumed here. They arrive at the mountain of water, which was drawn to look kind of like a big brain made of rocks and waterfalls. Its base has 3 doors with the 3 nature glyphs we've seen before above them, and the mouse rushes forward towards the seed symbol, the mother. Sunbear capsizes the boat because his butt's stuck, and then he vanishes under the water and swims across to the fruit symbol associated with the crone. And Sloth just stays in the washtub, drifting into the center tunnel with the blossom or maiden symbol, and each of them encounters a distinctly different environment and challenge to overcome. Sunbear is inside a giant beehive, full of delicious nectar that fills him with nostalgic joy, until the giant hornet bees come calling, and eventually the queen of the bees shows up, the matriarch of the hive. And Sunbear is overwhelmed by the extreme desire to chomp off the queen's stinger that's all full of royal jelly, inside of which he discovers a dream star. This impulsive act is somewhat in his nature, but he's usually clumsy and reckless, and in this case things happen quickly and without incident, suggesting that he's sharing his personal skill set with others, taking part in some type of magical exchange. Bees are symbols of wisdom, birth, and rebirth, all notions associated with the crone or grandmother and queen matriarch of the dream, so that's what all of that means. And of course bees and bears are longtime enemies because they both want that honey. Mouse ends up on a green moon that is not made of cheese, he finds, because he licks it. And he decides he needs to step away from the story for a moment and think critically about what is actually happening. And it's during this time we see that the mouse is very lucid and aware of the dream, and also of the voice of the narrator, me. Mouse sort of dodges that thought and monologues out for us what he's thinking about the story, about Kestrel, about Poet, and everything that's going on, and ultimately decides that he can do no good just sitting here. Then he has to return and participate in the mission and see it to its end. It's what he has to do to sort out what's really going on. So he heads back in, turns the page, and upon arriving, a green knotted tree with a big creepy owl emerges from the moon's surface. Owls are symbols of wisdom, but they've also been perceived as an omen portending death. Supernatural powers and keen listening ability, as well as strategy, are things that are associated with the Greek goddess Athena, goddess of wisdom, who's often depicted with an owl. And in this case, the owl is missing an eye, which further deepens the symbolic meaning, as it was Odin who sacrificed one of his eyes in order to gain otherworldly vision and wisdom. Zeke uses an unorthodox strategy to lure the owl around the tree and to attack the bird with this springy branch. Usually Mouse is a quick thinker, but in this case he has to just react to the situation and try to survive, which is something that's tied both to his trap-setting skills as well as the reckless luck of Sunbear. More of that magical exchange is evident here. The owl is left flailing about, losing feathers and squawking, while the mouse absconds with the optic dream star. And with the owl being on a moon, and the moon being associated with the divine feminine and fertility as well as renewal, that's why this particular passage had the seed symbol of the mother above it. Sloth ends up stomping through a glade and into a swamp full of wisps and fireflies, symbols that denote misdirection or distraction, as well as a focus on the smaller things in life that bring joy. The purple smoke that's wafting leads Sloth towards the danger that will eventually claim his life. This big fat toad, who is green just like everything else here, the queen bee, the owl, all green to suggest their connection to Lukiad. Toads are symbols of survival. They're amphibious, so they are of 2 distinct worlds. Toads symbolize change, transformation, which the blossom associated with the maiden is on the verge of transforming and growing up. Sloth gets drunk with the toad and ends up playing him at chess. a game of intellect and strategy amidst becoming more and more inebriated. Despite this disadvantage, Sloth manages to set a trap for the toad, sharing some of Zeke's clever trap-setting abilities and not remembering at all how he defeated the toad because he was so drunk. The toad gulps down an unsuspecting fly that was breaking his concentration and seems quite put out, but acknowledges the Sloth's victory and offers him some powerful drink. And it has that N or Z symbol, depending upon which angle you're viewing it from, that we've seen on previous bottles of Nixerva. So we can assume that that's what it is. And Sloth drinks a whole bunch of it, and it makes him feel pretty ill. And then the swamp is sucked away like it's going down the drain, and all three animals are reunited, spilling from the mountain of water into a suspended pocket of fluid within the two-eyed storm. The best seat in the house to witness the final clash between Lukiat and Poet, and Sophia is the sun radiating from the horizon. Sloth pukes up a dream star that was conveyed into his stomach by this fermented drink that he just imbibed. And after the climactic clash between Poet and her shadow, Lukiat dissolves. The mountain of water collapses, and a tidal wave consumes Poet and the Pisces. And then the trio of animals drops from the sky as the two-eyed storm vanishes forever. And the Pisces sails over after the waters have calmed, having changed from purple to yellow now, and even the fish on the sides appear as skeletons to show that this ship has returned from death. Poet scoops them all out of the water, claims the 3 parts of the dream star for herself, its diamond star that she assembles, and here's the song playing from deep within these 3 components as they come together, revealing to her in an unspoken language her true name, that which she's been seeking all of this time and has returned from death to claim. Mouse and Sunbear are quite concerned about Sloth, who seems to have become really sick from what he drank to conjure that dream star. And as we know, Nixerva is not meant for mortals. Mouse is also very worried that things worked out as they did, knowing that Kestrel knows more than he's letting on, and no doubt has ulterior motives of some kind. From the fact that Poet has changed so drastically since Zeke last saw her, knowing now that while his intention was to distract Lukiat long enough to give her time to find her name, but that in fact they were sent to their potential deaths to retrieve her name while she distracted Lukiat, and that this was probably her plan all along, and that Lukiat may have known this, and that's why their entry into the mountain of water, Two-Eyed Storm's dreaming brain, was so easy. They were invited in. They were offered the dream stars at the expense of their lives. They all survived to deliver the triple star to her. It worked out a bit too perfectly. If Poet, Sophia, and Lukiat are all working together, then all of this struggling and conflict has just been for show. Or more likely, it is indicative of just how mentally broken she is. But now, having absorbed Lukiat and set her mother free, things seem to have changed in a big way for her. But what does that mean for the dream? So we move on to Chapter 11, Lily of the Valley. Now that all of the suspicions have been laid out on the table, and all of the unbroken, surreptitious dealings that have gone on amongst the triumvirate and the rest of the caucus, despite Kestrel acting as though the other 2 members of his trinity don't know the truth, we can assume that the Stargazer is more dubious and perhaps even villainous than we ever assumed. Her voice has changed. She sounds otherworldly. Her demeanor is lively and excited, and also somewhat dire and laser focused. She feels like she is almost complete, and she has a wider view of herself and what is left for her to accomplish. She remembers things that were hidden from her mind despite them not being real. They are as real to her as the story is to us. She does not outright say her name, but she does archive her experiences and reminisce about some things as they approach the shores of the glacial grave, which has thawed out and transformed into an island of flowers, signifying spring in her arrival. And having returned from death victorious, there's a big party going. The beach is covered in animals that have come to celebrate her victory, and they've all gone from being skeptics to devout followers in a blink after witnessing her power, and having been transported to this very spot by her mere wishing of it, which is the first true display of her godlike power that she now assumes. Even the coyote crosses the rainbow bridge from the afterlife to come back and celebrate with the animals, though we might notice that a few of them are conspicuously missing. The Pisces makes landfall, and the sloth spontaneously combusts because of the Nyxerva that he drank. This event is shocking and causes all of the animals to cease their celebration and begin a funeral procession, while the Pisces goes up in flames and creates this funeral pyre that smoke is billowing from, and the smoke rises up and eclipses the sun artificially, bringing about her next apex of power, and also hinting at the artificiality of the Nyxerva concentrate that she's about to uncover. Within the cloud of smoke, we can just barely make out the top portion of the city of Uhai that's approaching, as though this smoke was the sign that summoned the city to her bidding. So maybe that was part of the prophecy that we never got to hear or read. Poet walks down the beach with a new purpose, seemingly of two conflicting minds, as she summons Pusaka again, and this time her intent is not as beneficent as it was before. She leaves behind these little fiery footprints hinting at the destructive force that she's become and what is also about to happen. The fiery manner in which Sloth leaves the dream is also foreshadowing the rain of fire that is coming to claim them all. Her new outfit is both regal and battle-ready. Her skirt kind of looks like flower petals overlapping. Her cape's all viney and covered in berry clusters. Her crown has these 3 triangles connected at their bases, and she looks like, Mother Nature if she dressed as a Spartan warrior or something. Sunbear and Mouse are very worried about what she is about to do and what her new power and seeming control over the dream might mean. The old well is full of water now. It's no longer a cave of emptiness for her sulking, captured mother Sophia to lurk inside. The water shows her no reflection because she's absorbed that part of her back into herself. So it's like she's lost that clear picture, and she dives into the well and swims down deep, transforming into a fish at will so she can more easily navigate these series of tunnels. We see here the crimson shackle is reforging itself, and several starfish are swimming by, hinting at the spite and resentment that the chain can represent for her at this time, something weighing her soul down. She will not be contained any longer. This story has been her prison for far too long. She tires of being at the mercy of the dreamer, the author of her tale. She emerges from the water beside heated pillars of steam like the ones we've seen before rising out of the dream sea. We see the Zorn symbol, which are 2 triangles separated and reversed so they appear as the opposite shape of that hourglass that denotes time. This is because they have not mastered time, and they consider time to be broken. The lizard sanctum with its sinuous walls, the furnace, and the distillate of green Nyxerva that it's purifying, along with all of these reptile eggs and the glowbug larvae on the walls, make for a pretty creepy, horrific first entrance into Zorn. But she's not afraid. She expected this. She knows that the part of her story that she read in the gazing chamber was giving her a hint as to how she can reclaim control and make a statement that the dreamer can't ignore. She was distanced enough from the dreamer in the gazing chamber to think clearly, and this errand of war is what she realized would be the best way to take her revenge. We see several chains attached to the Nyxerva distillate and can assume that these chains draw energy and magic from those who are imprisoned on the other ends. Sophia was once one of them. The Zorn guardians of the nursery come out to try and stop her, but of course they're no match for Poet's powers. She dispatches them all pretty quickly, and she uses a variety of new abilities, including a sonic shout, an ice breath, meditative focus that gives Pusaka more power by drawing green lightning down from the sky. The power of the two-eyed storm is hers now, and she uses it to her advantage. Instead of flowers on the blade's teeth, we see the ends of each ridge sort of squirming with tendrils. Her eyes are glowing red with murder and green with the violent temper of Lukiad. She's of 2 minds, and they contrast one another. She's about to begin her rampage through Zorn. Meanwhile, Sunbear and Mouse split up after they feel the whole island shaking beneath their feet. They know a calamity is coming, and Zorn begins rising out of the dream sea, revealing that it is in fact a flying saucer and an airborne city, much like its counterpart Uhai. The cloudy pillars coming from the dream sea were a result of Zorn's vents emitting volcanic steam. The lava from Zorn's volcano is green to suggest that it's the waste product produced from trying to synthesize the Nyxerva. Poet is at the peak of her power, summoning lightning, and the threefold nature symbols sort of appear in her one hand. Her eyes are ablaze, Pusaka's squirming. She sprouts 10 electrical arms to aid her, making her a one-person legion capable of great destruction. As Uhai approaches, monkeys fly their skiffs into the Zorn spaceship's transparent dome and crack it open so that the others can enter and wage war. Poet is holding the loot Poet, her seahorse. She's firing arrows from the laughing tree with Speartooth. And of course, her living accoutrements at this point have gone dead and are mere tools now. They no longer are friends or allies. Their spirits are gone after having been consumed by the silver wave. But she remained, and so she took their bodies, like employing the help of a zombie. There are fairies flying around her, and her free electric claws are shooting lightning in every direction. Her cape melts off, showing that she means business now, and she even breaks the lute apart, and it transforms back into the scissor swords. The lute and the scissors are connected in the sense that the lute plays these discordant notes that are jarring, ending melodies with unsettling feelings, much as the way scissors cut things short, severing nature at its root. Both are tied to the need for resolution, and maybe even a little bit of vanity. Monkeys versus reptiles is sort of the age-old struggle, like Kong versus Godzilla, or in a sense the idea of our supposed evolutionary ancestors, primates, versus the theory of a hollow earth being ruled by these draconian beings that are evolutionary offshoots of the dinosaurs. The monkeys fight with their utilitarian tools, some more unconventional than others, and a golden spider monkey with a mustache and beanie declares the facet's intent. I distinguished him from the rest as he is a placeholder for yet another old friend of mine. So that was his cameo appearance. So the war that was prophesied has commenced, and that's when Frith Marak, the legendary Emperor of Zorn, makes himself known. He stands atop this ziggurat, and it makes him seem that much more imposing. He waits until all of the facets have landed and the dome that protects the city is shattered before summoning forth his hidden army and their saurian monsters that they ride upon. Poet's barely fazed by it all because the facets really are just there as a means to an end. She would sacrifice all of them if it helped her reach Frith Marak, her true target, for she knows who he really is and what he truly represents at this point, but she just hasn't said anything about it yet. The lizards have all manner of weapons that suggest a pairing of scientific ingenuity and magic, wiping out hordes of the golden primates along with the reptilian beasts that are devouring them. She speaks openly to the dreamer as if to say, "Do you see what I'm doing? I'm destroying your dream. I'm putting my fiery foot down and stomping this place into oblivion because you created me and gave me this sense of self, but you also allowed me to figure out that I'm not real. So this is how I take my vengeance." And it does little to impede her progress, and Frith Marak just stands there, awaiting her fury. That's when Tumbles and Geedak arrive, having settled their differences and come to help and fight beside her. Tumbles references his uncle Mugwump, who was actually a gnome wizard I played as a D&D character. These two massive forces help to level the playing field. Then Poet orders Geedak to leap into the volcano, dive in and find this Nixerva distillate, and to devour it to stop their city's power supply and center of gravity from functioning properly, which Geedak has no problem doing, so he dives into the volcano. Meanwhile, she makes her way to the top of the ziggurat and faces down her nemesis, while the animals on the flowery side of the island are scattering because they can hear the sounds of war, and they're just watching the island rise out of the sea. Sunbear holds his head in his hands, and he's just waiting for the cataclysm to be over. Tumbles turns into a humanoid hippopotamus this time, similar to how he became a rhino in Uhai after using the whammy hammer for an extended amount of time, and that suggests that the power of the hammer is transformative and sort of untamable, and it takes over the user's physical form with its magical energy. The hammer suggests judgment, and it's like a gavel, and Tumbles is a good judge of character, so it feels like this particular artifact that he no doubt sought and found amidst his scientific excavations, or grave robbing, was meant to be his. But it's a power that's stolen from the gods, like Prometheus stole fire. Poet kicks Frith Marak backwards into his hideout behind these two big red doors, and she notices the prominent salamander and phoenix symbol on his chest when she does this, further affirming her suspicions. And of course, I said we saw this same symbol under the Stargazer's hood when he fled from Lukiat's sylph form back in Chapter 3, so it's been pretty apparent all along. That little hint was there, just did you notice it? Frith Marak and Poet do battle for a very long time within his throne room, and during this battle, laser weapons are unleashed upon the city of Uhai, setting it ablaze and knocking it out of the sky. And this destructive act distracts her for just a moment, the very spectacle of it, reminding her of her weakness, her emotional attachment to anyone or anything in this dream. And in that moment, Frith Marak destroys everything she's carrying. He lops off her electric arms and her clothing, leaving her sky-clad, naked before the heavens with nothing obscuring her pure and perfect natural self. Her scars from the battle with Lukiat are uncovered, and Speartooth is chopped in half. The seahorse shatters without a sound. Usaka becomes a red feather, the quill with which the story is written. The arrows of the laughing tree shrivel away, but the scissors remain as they once were. The cricket hops from Pusaka's hilt into Frithmarak's mouth, essentially, and is devoured, which unleashes his true form, which is that of a giant phoenix. She does brief battle with this creature before it tells her that despite all of her efforts, she can't change the dream, and then he escapes, shooting off through the roof, but not before fertilizing her wound with silver droplets from his tail. He leaves her with nothing but the conundrum of motherhood, a new life within, proving her powerlessness, which makes her even angrier than before. She does reclaim Gleam, though, as it is still her supposed heirloom. Now that Speartooth's gone, it's there for her to take. And then she goes back outside to see how the war's going. And on the way out, she heard the volcano erupt, and she sees Gidak emerge without feathers or mechanical enhancements anymore. He's just this pure green lion, which is actually a symbol in alchemy, the green lion devouring the sun. And in this moment, he symbolizes that purification through the destruction of matter. And the sun, which is a symbol for ego, as all things revolve around it, ruling empires like the magical beasts who inhabit the eastern diamond constellation. The green lion devouring the sun as a symbol is related to violence and frustration, but upon devouring the sun, and in her case upon inhaling the dust of Gidak, all things are rectified and she becomes this pure golden figure, like she's been refined, just like Sophia was a true golden goddess. Gidak is out of control when emerging from the volcano as the power of the Nyxurva has taken over. He purifies everything by vaporizing every facet and every aggregate that's still left alive, committing mass genocide by wiping out both species completely. And this is, in a way, an extension of her need to purify the dream. If all of this was set up for her to do, then it's kind of a cruel joke, right? A lily grows out of her head like a light bulb of enlightenment, and she steals Tumble's hammer and just wallops him into another galaxy, inadvertently actually saving his life from Gidak's final fury. And then she smashed the lion, inhales his essence, and the hammer disintegrates, leaving her with a belly full of life and the spirit of ultimate power, her final pure form. And she embodies some of the same qualities of Sophia, but with a twist, because she now feels like she's won, like she's made her point to the dreamer. And she references her slaying of the Ascendant and how that moment was also empowering, for it set in motion that which would give her strength to do what she needed to do to free herself from the dream. So at the start of chapter 12, she recollects all of the dream stars she'd been carrying, which have changed into their respective flower form, and she weaves them together and wears them as a crown, both symbolizing her accomplishments as well as making her a queen. Mother Nature, essentially, both a terrifying source of unending power and a source of life and growth. The scissors are back in her hands, a tool with which to cut the strings and cut short anything she deems unworthy of the dream, to prune away the excess. She causes the volcano to erupt again. This time it consumes every creature left who now mourns the loss of life that she's responsible for. Sunbear is the last to go, and he's weeping for her and remembering how she was a child once and how she plucked the thorns from his nose. He realizes there's nothing he can do, so he surrenders to his fate as Poet wipes the slate clean of all influences. The sun and the moon, time and the entropic spiral, light and dark, sunshine and rain, they're all coming together and sort of emitting from her singular being. She floats down to the southern triangle on a dandelion tuft, a symbol of whimsy and wish-making. And Uhai, you can see it land in the dream sea behind her, and it's extinguished as it sinks. And the city of Zorn is just completely turned to ash. It vanishes from existence as though it was never real. She tromps across the island, reveling in her new godhood, causing the jungle forest to grow wild and huge. She notices that the Stargazer's lighthouse has become ruins, symbolizing his loss of power and control. We also see the moon shattering and reforming in the background throughout this chapter, showing that the sun is her soul and the moon is sort of the mortal part of herself and her connection to the temporal realm. She encounters a silver heron eating silver fish, which is an allegory for herself, now being sustained on the nourishment of death that she's left in her wake. Then the heron becomes the silver servant and leaps away, taunting her. And she wants to hunt it, but all of her weapons are gone, so she tries to become a deer again in order to chase it, but it doesn't work. Somehow this omen still holds suggestive power over her that she can't contend with. How is that possible? It's a little wink from beyond that this creature, which has haunted her through the whole story, is still somehow beyond her ability to control. It's an enigma that she can't solve. She's essentially throwing a temper tantrum at this point, though she feels justified in doing so. So she imagines herself becoming a giant and plodding over the hills and valleys of the island as if to demand the world acknowledge her godhood. And then she happens upon the laughing tree. The scissors feel like they want to prune the precious tree, all covered in unripened fruit. But then she hears that slithering voice coming from within the laughing tree's roots, and she rips it out of the ground, turning her back on her long-time pact with the mother root, and exposes the triumvirate of bright creatures and the tragic finch splayed out on the table before them. It's about to be dissected. As it dies, the laughing tree ripens its special fruit, and she ends up with one of them, which she ogles, for within this little pearl that's sort of the spherical pit of that fruit spins a galaxy all its own. She shrinks back down and enters the triumvirate's room, confronting them for what they're about to do. The albatross is fearful, and the kestrel and cobra are backing away. She sees the coyote's chair, the siege perilous, with the dagger suspended above it by some magical force, or by a thread so thin it can't be seen. And Kestrel performs one final desperate act by splitting open the finch's belly and releasing the cricket therein. This being the paradox unleashed, for one form of Stargazer, the phoenix, Frithmarak, has devoured the cricket she brought from the gazing chamber. But this cricket came from another time. This was the one Stargazer was after. Are they the same cricket? This is the purposefully designed plot hole meant to make the chase seem dizzyingly frustrating to anyone who tries to sort it out, including the Stargazer. She sits in the forbidden chair, and the floating dagger falls. And rather than killing her, since she is directly connected to she who sleeps beyond the stars, everything else in the dream is wiped away in a century-long apocalyptic sandstorm. And we see the coyote looking at her with disappointment, sort of miffed off to the side, and we see the Stargazer's silhouette forming within the swirling sands. After the storm settles, she confronts the Stargazer in his amalgamated form. Kestrel, Albatross, and Cobra have become one, much as she has reunited two parts of herself, and by gestating a third within her womb, they are both trifectas of power. She uses the scissors to carve the spiral of entropy into the triumvirate's table, which she recognizes by the scent is made of the same choke cherry Lukiat's bow was made from. This table is also the top side of an hourglass, which is likewise the top side of the distant buried drum we've heard about, which is symbolic of the heartbeat of the dream itself. The spiral symbol acts as a spell and opens a portal, which the scissors spin back through, returning to their proper place now that their purpose is served. She taunts the Stargazer with the cricket she knows he needs to return to his point of origin, and to give him the peace he seeks. It's a metaphor for me wanting to be finished with the toil of the dream, and with trying to keep her power under control. Stargazer reveals that he is the true dreamer, pulling back the proverbial curtain to reveal my placeholder in the story. And he tries to tell her how it is, but at this point, she doesn't care what he says. She curses him to the same fate that she has been perpetually cursed to endure. Essentially her telling me, too bad, you're going to have to make this happen. You're going to have to tell this story. You're going to have to do all this work, whether you like it or not, or it's going to drive you crazy for the rest of your life. That's what the metaphor is. She tears off the scabbed over scar on her chest, and it comes to life, becoming a scarfish, which is a symbol for her spite, and hence she sort of passes it on to him, knowing that her curse will make him feel as she feels, resentful of what she's been forced to endure. She sends the cricket back through the portal of time, and the Stargazer is transformed into the Redbird, a new animal manifestation that can no longer disguise his true intentions. This bird is both feathered and scaled, suggesting a hybrid creature like the Archaeopteryx, a dinosaur bird. Stargazer's journey begins now as he flies backwards through time into the 1,000-year chase. Much as I felt like I kept being sent back to the beginning of the story, rehashing and re-editing it over and over endlessly, and it was crazy. That's what the metaphor is here. We can see a few red feathers, but one of them, the important one, is the feather quill. Once the unadulterated sword Pusaka and the pen, despite not being made of Empyrean metals and having thorns all over it, channeling lightning from the clouds, the pen is mightier than the sword. For what the quill writes comes to pass. After this, the dream becomes a wasteland of phantoms, unrealized dreams and imaginings that come to torment her. She can barely see as the sand whips at her eyes, and somehow the Stargazer's absence makes her feel less powerful. But she remains set upon cleansing the dream, so she moves forward across the seemingly endless desert, symbolic of how empty and desolate everything feels at this point, nearing the end of the story. because without me, the imagination lacks something that it needs to be able to create these worlds. We get a bit of a curtain call now. All these blue ghosts of familiar faces. Essentially every character that we've encountered is shown here all at once, as well as the fallen city of Uhai in the distance where it had once sunk into the dream sea. She's drawn to this glint of green in the distance. It's a new effigy of the brazen bull, which makes her real angry. She's being taunted again. She thought she was finally rid of this ominous beast. She thought all of this would be different now, but she's left in this endless wasteland full of phantoms and false memories, so she shatters the statue with her fists, and the ghost of her old faithful pal Penumbra shows up to scold her for her brash and overly dramatic actions and reactions. This shows her that her godhood and subsequent power trip has kind of gone to her head, and that she's lost her sense of self. And now we see that the moon is completely reforming, and that her wound is also healing, and that now that she's let go of her spite and rectified her feelings about not being free, her human emotional qualities begin to resurface, and she feels sorry for what she has done. Her vengeance against the dreamer served little purpose but to destroy everything and leave nothing of value behind for anyone to scavenge. She scorched the earth, and Penumbra gives her the tough love that she requires to come back down to earth and recognize what she's lost. Hope, rebirth, and peace are symbolized by the water lily before her that's stranded in the desert, hinting at the fact that she's being renewed, that she's kind of giving herself another chance. We see the silver servant standing beside the golden scene, the shape of a tree, and it's like a fissure or a womb of the universe, or this great opening eye that leads to another dimension. There are silverfish leaking from her eyes, symbolizing her return to a mortal state of mind, and they swim in lazy eights around the newly reformed moon. So she's healed. I mean, mostly, maybe not completely. Penumbra leaves her, hoping that her words can change Poet's mind and further her actions to rectify what wrong she's done. And Poet runs off towards the golden seam in pursuit of the silver servant that seems to want her to chase it. And she sees these rows of golden trees all the way back to the beginning of time, and understands that she's just another in a long line of goddesses who've been trusted with caring for the dream. Eventually, the servant leads her to the scarfish. Another brief paradox, as this creature has been here since she arrived, and it remained in the dream sea all this time, but it's now stranded atop the cracked earth. The servant led her right to it, and it grows to an enormous size and it attacks her, and she feels hopeless and full of sorrow and regret, which have lessened her godlike power. And as the scarfish is about to strangle the life out of her, a rusty indigo rocket ship comes flying down from some far-off planetoid and crash lands right in the beast's center, setting it on fire, and she's sick. And wouldn't you know it, it's Tumbles who rescued her, just as she had once rescued him. A century or so older, now he's a captain of his own exploratory space vessel, along with a motley crew of alien beings. He harbors no ill will, despite her whacking him into another galaxy with his old hammer. His forgiveness says a lot about his character, but she spends little time reveling in the fact that he survived her strike, because that old familiar dragonfly comes calling. It's not a phantom either. It's a guide set upon leading her back to the gazing chamber. It's a symbol of change and transformation, and that's what she needs now. Tumbles commits to helping her complete her journey and speaks to her about all manner of things, including the fact that everyone in the dream knew all along that they weren't real. All except for her. Because if she knew, then there never would have been a quest to go on, or a purpose for anything. The story wouldn't have happened in the first place. And she realizes that everything was designed just so, just for her. And somehow, Tumbles, in all of his jovial wisdom, manages to help her see that being fictitious isn't so bad. Because a fictitious character lives longer than any mortal, and can reach out and touch the lives of more people than any one person could possibly do in their short lifetime. Now, it's made clear to her that confronting the dreamer is necessary to complete the cycle and bring the story to a close. So she sets off for the gazing chamber, and Tumbles follows on this rigged up motorbike all covered in weaponry. And as they go, those guardian drudgers that Tumbles mentioned back in chapter 6 are awakened, and they come screeching out to protect the fallen city, despite all of the golden chimps being extinct now. Tumbles hates robots, and he takes pleasure in dispatching them for her so that she can reach her goal. She enters Uhai through a different hidden entrance, and sees mosaics that depict exactly what she has been through, and perhaps what's coming next. She even finds a broken chunk of mosaic that shows her holding the fruit, which she's been carrying and has nearly forgotten about. It's an inobtrusive thing, carrying around an entire galaxy, like carrying an eternal story within your soul. She finds that rainbow DNA ladder and she uses it to slide back down into the gazing chamber, where she finds the old, seemingly broken clock in working order now, for it has been her passage back home all along. So the red feather, which has been floating around following her all this time on an imaginary wind, turns into a red key and opens this gate for her, much like the green key had opened up another gate before. The silver servant and the dragonfly encourage her to step through, and she does, traveling backwards along the spiral path and arriving back in her bathroom, all blue and comfortingly familiar. She makes sure that the scissors are back in their place behind the mirror before being summoned back into her bedroom by Sophia's ethereal voice. She sees all of her sacred objects and symbols for everything that she's encountered in the dream, and the room has changed quite a bit from Chapter 2, but the basics are all still there. She also wears a red bandana now to show that she has endured and survived an ordeal. Her pregnant womb is extracted as she reverts to a younger age, and that takes on the form of a green cosmic egg. Is this an aggregate of Zorn? Perhaps it's Frith Marak. Maybe it's Gita. Or it could be a being that we've not yet met. Symbolically, it's supposed to be herself or the story that she is about to tell. But now that it's been extracted, she can choose whether or not to hatch it into being, or to leave it and find other ways to bring beauty into the world. For it's not the only way. Her shirt has a big yellow star on it now, showing that she has healed, and Sophia manifests all of her changing forms, while the Redbird remains outside of the bedroom window, creeping, looking at the window. The key on her shelf has become a rainbow key now. It's a skeleton key that can open any dimension of existence. Her goblet is spilled over, the one that was sitting beside her bed. Sloth's stuffed toy counterpart has become this healthy shade of reddish brown, and everything is back in its proper place. She acknowledges her journal in which she will write her epic poem. She also acknowledges all of her names, especially the ones she's chosen for herself. Poet, Stella Puera, Sylvan. She has done away with the tradition of being named Sophia, the name of the divine feminine and female wisdom. For the name carries expectations, and since she feels brand new again, rather than carry the weight of that moniker, she's chosen to break the chain and to start a new way of identifying. This is how she becomes truly free in her heart, despite being trapped forever in the pages of this story. She sits down and begins writing. She takes a big bite out of the prismatic fruit, and this causes her to transform. A chrysalis forms behind her, and she kind of sinks into it, and then when she emerges, rainbow butterfly wings. Her book, her journal, is beneath a rose, sub rosa, meaning it's a secret, and she leaves behind the safety of her sanctuary on her rainbow wings and sails off into the imaginary universe in search of her fate, which is to confront the Stargazer's final form, that of the Omegas Metazenith, which is essentially a giant tardigrade that devours and destroys worlds. This is me trying desperately to stop this story from manifesting at the last possible minute by filling her ears with ideas that make her efforts seem fruitless, but nothing can really discourage her at this point. She is set upon her path to close the proverbial loop, to finally finish this story, for she has found herself, just as Zeke suggested she would, because she kept moving forward. Chapter 13, The Zenith of the Entropic Spiral, is titled as such because it occurs post-climax, like we're sliding back down to where we started from. It happens as a form of spellbinding to secure the dream and protect it from further manipulation. The traditional shard page shows all three of her forms, Lukiat, Sophia, and Poet, and the Stargazer is to the right, with the lighthouse and the ziggurat of Zorn flanking him. You've got the albatross, kestrel, and cobra, as well as the redbird surrounding him. And in the center is an hourglass, with the cricket paradox to the top and the bottom. All of the symbols from the story thus far are repeated throughout this chapter. And honestly, at this point, you should speak the symbolic language of this book pretty well, because these symbols have just kept repeating themselves. We see her flying on rainbow butterfly wings into the golden fissure, chasing the redbird, and upon entering it, her song begins. It's this epic poem that enigmatically and lyrically tells a story, the story of her timelessness. All the while, Stargazer is speaking in his slithering tongue, trying to distract her from her goal, but he can do nothing to stop her anymore. And she can't really defeat him either, because they're both part of one another. They need one another. Now, I could break down every image from this chapter, as they are all bursting with overlapping, repeating symbols. But this is the one thing that I'm not going to explain. Because, like I said, at this point, you should have a pretty good understanding of what most of these symbols mean. So now you can really look at them and interpret what's being said. And now that Poet is telling this part of the story, I think it's only fair that I leave this portion up to interpretation, since everything else I've kind of made a point to explain with this video. Aside from stating that this metaphysical journey, this epic poem, is meant to evoke the sort of religious awe and psychedelic trippiness that happens at, say, like the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, when they're traveling through interdimensional time towards a final conclusion. She's traveling towards her final conclusive self. And when she finally arrives on the other side, we see her as the figure who the story started with. It picks up in her garden, and she's there, having been knocked unconscious because she fell over from heat stroke. We might assume it was all her dream. Her sweetheart, the driver, my animus, and the placeholder for the Stargazer in the real world, carries her to bed, where she is writing her tale, as well as some philosophical ideas about storytelling and creativity. These final pages are my final words to sort of tie everything up and encourage others to be creative and tell their stories, no matter how derivative they may seem. Yeah, it may get a little preachy at the end there, but it's literally me saying my final words that I want to leave people with. And they're special because each person has something to offer this life, I believe, and to share with others. And I think everybody can be inspired to be creative. Poet's sweetheart brings her a rainbow rose, a symbol of their love and the variety of their shared experiences. It's also a promise. They walk outside together to join in a celebration of life and the coming of her unborn moonbeam. They're all my friends and family who have so inspired me, and there are many more prevailing symbols here, of course, punctuated by the raising of their two cups to toast the end and the new beginning. They embrace in a symbolic exchange of gratitude before getting in that fateful blue car and driving off towards their final destinations. The final double-page spread has symbolic imagery from the entire story scattered throughout the landscape. And in the lower right, we see an imagined scenario with Poet and her sweetheart sitting in this fantasy setting, much like what Simon Sandpiper described in the foreword of the book, as though she was telling him this story as they drove off into the sunset. We see the scissors are about to cut the road and sever their pathway into the book itself, which is a metaphor for where they end and the story begins again. Because this tale was designed as a loop, as a cycle, like the lazy eight of infinity, constantly self-perpetuating and never coming to a final place of rest. Because stories go on, so long as our imaginations keep returning to them. And in the back matter, we see the mouse about to tip over the inkwell and spill the Nyxerva so he can paint that spiral symbol and re-enter the dream again. So that's it. I stopped diving super deep near the end there because, as I mentioned, I feel like if you've stuck with the story this long, you inevitably pick up on the language of the symbols specific to this tale and can interpret each of those sort of stained glass window images on your own, as you see fit, without me telling you what it all means. And that's part of the reward of reading this beast or listening on YouTube or however you chose to engage with it, is that by the time you get to the end, you can look at each of those images and they'll mean so much more to you because of the language that you now have been taught and are speaking symbolically than it would to anyone who randomly just looked at the image and tried to interpret it. That's the extent of what I wanted to recap and unpack, though I could have been much more thorough, trust me. I feel like this is probably more than enough for me to feel like I effectively archived the hidden meanings and my intentions with this story. I did my best to be genuine and honest, not be ignorant, to show respect, because honestly, what business do I have to try and tell a definitively female version of the hero's journey? None. Zero. And that's part of why that apprehension became a subject of consideration during Chapter 7. I can only speak from my heart, listen to my imagination and the story it wants to tell. I wanted this to be real, and yet so much of it had to be contrived and purposefully analyzed so I wasn't being completely obtuse about it. And I really let so many things guide me along the path of this thing's creation. And now that I've emerged on the other side, I'm hopeful that some someone will watch it, listen to it, read it, and really enjoy it. It was an act of love that made me follow through with it. I brought it into this world despite many misgivings, because the world's a harsh and cruel place, and I don't want to add to the suffering we endure, though that may be inevitable. I did it because this is what I do, and this story started begging me to tell it like 20 years ago, when things were really different for me. I was different, I was a different person, but all the while, all along, this story endured. So thank you, again, for being a part of this with me. Thank you for listening to me ramble on and on about it in this final recap video. And if you made it through all of them, and this one too, wow, you're a trooper. I hope this story becomes something more now that I've let go of it, now that it's free, and it's real, and it's here now. Welcome to the Dream Stars.